The old man's death was a long one. He wheezed for 3 days. He didn't sleep a wink for 3 nights. The workshop reeked of camphor and hot wax. 40 clocks on the walls ticked at different rates. Eli sat by the bed and counted the pauses between breaths. 7 seconds. 9. 12. He knew that rhythm. That's how a clock stops. Not all at once. The spring makes its final effort in jerks. Master Holzer lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. His hands were yellow and dry as old parchment. For 12 years, those hands had taught Eli to hear what no one else could hear, the silence between the ticks, the place where the real malfunction hides. The old man suddenly jerked. His fingers clamped down on Eli's wrist with such force that the bone ached. The master's eyes were clouded by fever, but something sharp, something like fear. Holzer rasped that behind the back wall there was an engraved panel, that a case was hidden behind it, that Eli must take it and never give it to anyone, and fix it if he could. The voice trailed off. His fingers unclenched. His chest rose one last time and did not fall again. Eli sat motionless. He didn't cry. He hadn't been able to cry since he was 7, since the day they took him from the orphanage and brought him to the workshop, where it smelled of oil and tea. He just sat there and listened as the 40 clocks on the walls continued to tick. Not a single one had stopped. The master was dead, but the clocks kept ticking. There was a cruel irony in that. The man who had spent his whole life fixing time couldn't fix his own. Eli closed the old man's eyes. He pulled the blanket up to his chin. He stood up. His legs were stiff from sitting for 3 days. He walked through the workshop, past workbenches piled high with gears and springs, past shelves of tools, past an old teapot on the stove that had gone cold 2 days ago, the back wall. Holzer had never let him near it. He said it was damp and full of rats. Eli ran his fingers along the boards, the third one from the left. The engraving was almost worn away, but his fingers felt the outline. A small circle inside a large one, the symbol of the Watchmaker's Guild. Eli pried the board loose. Behind it was a niche the size of a shoebox. Inside lay a blackwood case, heavy, warm to the touch even though the wall was ice cold. He opened the lid. Inside, resting on a lining of dark velvet, was a pocket watch. No hands, no numbers on the dial. The lid was covered with symbols that Eli had never seen in any of the guild's textbooks, not in any reference book, not in any of the books Holzer had forced him to read in the evenings. The symbols were engraved so finely that they looked like a pattern. But Eli had been an apprentice for 12 years. His eyes could make out a hairline crack in the gear. These weren't patterns. They were words in a language he didn't know. And one more detail. An empty slot gaped in the mechanism, a place where a gear was missing. Eli held the clock to his ear. Silence. Not a single tick. A dead mechanism. He stood in the semi-darkness by the wall, holding in his hands the object his master had hidden for 40 years. For 40 years, Holzer had lived right next to him and said nothing. He fed him soup. He taught him how to wind the springs. He told him about the workings of a pendulum, and not once did he utter a word about the clock without hands hidden behind the wall. Eli thought that the old man, too, had his own silence between the ticks, and that he hadn't learned to listen to it in time. The funeral was the next day. 4 people came. The grocer from the next street who owed Holzer money for repairing a wall clock, the widow from the top floor who brought the master a cabbage pie every Thursday, the harbor watchman who once dragged a broken chronometer from a sunken ship into the workshop, and Father Anselm Y., a huge Korean man in a worn cassock, a former priest, a former port fighter. His voice was quiet, like that of a man accustomed to being heard not because he shouts, but because he is right. Anselm said a prayer, not a church prayer, something of his own, about craftsmen who pass away but leave their work behind, about hands that remember more than the mind. Eli listened and clutched the watch without hands in his pocket. It was warm, as if something were still alive inside it. After the funeral, he returned to the workshop. He sat down at the workbench. He placed the watch in front of him. He took out a magnifying glass. He took out a set of screwdrivers, and he began to do the only thing he knew how to do: take it apart. The back cover gave way on the second try. Inside, the mechanism was perfect. Eli had seen thousands of watches in his lifetime. Cheap knockoffs from the market, expensive timepieces from the capital, antique pocket watches with triple chimes. None of them even came close to what lay before him. The gears were cut from a metal he didn't recognize. The springs were coiled with a precision that seemed impossible for human hands. Every part was fitted to the one next to it so tightly that not even a ray of light could pass between them, and all of it lay silent, because one gear was missing, that very one. In the empty slot at the center of the mechanism, Eli closed the lid. He rubbed his eyes. It was 3 in the morning. Outside the window, the port was bustling. Seagulls were crying out somewhere. He put the watch in his pocket and lay down on the watchmaker's bed. The blanket smelled of camphor. He closed his eyes and thought that tomorrow he would have to open the workshop. People would bring in their watches, ordinary watches with ordinary problems, broken springs, worn-down teeth, misaligned pendulums. He would fix them, because that's the only thing he knows how to do, and the only thing that makes sense. In the morning, he woke up to a sound, a quiet one, almost inaudible. Tick, just one. Eli sat up in bed. The clock without hands lay on the nightstand nearby. He held it to his ear. Silence, or so it seemed. He opened the back cover and looked inside. The empty compartment was no longer empty. A gear stood there, tiny, dark. It didn't shine like the other parts. It looked as if it had always been part of the mechanism, but last night it hadn't been there. Eli was sure of it. He had examined every millimeter of that watch. The compartment had been empty, and now there was a gear in it that had appeared out of nowhere. His hands weren't shaking. An apprentice's hands don't shake. Holzer had drilled that into him during his very first year, but his heart was beating faster than it should. He closed the cover, put the watch in his pocket, went out into the workshop, lit the burner. He put the kettle on. He took out 2 cups out of habit. He looked at the second one. He put it back. He sat down at the workbench and waited for his first customer. The first customer arrived around noon. An old woman with a wall clock and a canvas bag. The pendulum was bent. The mainspring had weakened. A half-hour job. Eli took the order. The woman asked where Master Holzer was. Eli replied that the master had left. The woman looked at him with that expression people have when they understand but don't want to ask for clarification. She nodded. She left the clock. She left. By evening, 2 more people arrived. A port clerk with a pocket watch whose glass had cracked, and a young errand boy from a jeweler in the upper city. The jeweler had sent a carriage watch with a broken striking mechanism. There was plenty of work. Eli repaired them. His hands moved on their own. 12 years of muscle memory, a screwdriver, tweezers, a magnifying glass, oil. He could do it with his eyes closed. And while his hands worked, his mind wandered to the watch in his pocket, to the gear that had appeared out of nowhere, to the symbols on the caseback, to the dying old man's words, to fix it, if he could. Fix what? A watch without hands, without numbers, without any visible function. What's the point of a watch that shows nothing? That evening, he locked up the workshop. He sat down at the workbench. He placed the watch in front of him, and he tried again. A magnifying glass, a light, the back cover. The mechanism lay before him in all its impossible beauty. The gear that had appeared that morning was still in place. Eli tried to turn it with tweezers. It didn't budge, as if it had grown into place. He ran his eyes over the rest of the parts. Springs, anchors, balances. Everything was in place. Everything was intact. But the watch wasn't running. He counted the teeth, checked the clearances, gauged the tension of the springs by the sound. Everything was perfect, and everything was dead. By midnight, he gave up. He closed the back cover. He went to bed. On the 3rd day after the funeral, Eli went to the waterfront. He needed some fresh air. The workshop felt suffocating. The smell of camphor wouldn't go away. He walked along the docks. The salty wind blew in his face. Barges clattered against the stone. Dock workers hauled crates. A typical day at the port of St. Maura. He stopped at the 3rd pier. A young woman was standing at the edge, holding a child in her arms. The boy was a year old, maybe a year and a half. He was squirming and reaching out toward the water. His mother held him with one hand. In the other, she carried a basket. A seagull cried out right above their heads. The mother turned around for just a second. The child slipped away. His body struck the side of the barge, a soft, heavy thud, then a splash. The mother screamed. The basket flew onto the rocks. People rushed to the edge of the pier. Someone shouted that they needed a boat hook. Someone ran for a rope. Eli didn't think. He jumped. The water in the port of Saint-Maurice in early spring was so cold it took his breath away. He dove. The child was trapped between the side of the barge and the pier wall, motionless. Eli pulled him out. He surfaced. Hands reached down and grabbed the wet body, lifting it onto the rocks. Eli climbed out on his own. The child was lying on his back, blue, eyes closed. His chest wasn't moving. The mother was howling, a low, animalistic sound that made you want to cover your ears. People stood around. Someone was muttering a prayer. Someone else turned away. Eli dropped to his knees beside the body. He knew he was supposed to compress the chest. He'd seen it done. But instead, his hand reached into his pocket of its own accord. A watch without hands, warm, even hot. He took it out and pressed it against the child's chest, and the world changed. He saw, not with his eyes, with something else, something that lived beyond his eyes. A mechanism hovered above the child's body, transparent, translucent, glowing, as small as an adult's fist. Gears were moving inside, almost all of them. Except for one, the ratchet, a tiny part right in the center. It was cracked. The break ran diagonally, like a crack in the ice. Eli looked at it and knew. He couldn't explain how he knew, but he knew. That crack was a second. The second when the mother turned her head at the cry of a seagull. A second of lapsed attention. That was enough. The ratchet cracked. The child's watch stopped. Eli opened his mouth. His throat was dry from the seawater. He swallowed and spoke. The ratchet of lapsed attention. The watch in his hand ticked once, loudly. The world around him trembled, like ripples on the water from a thrown stone. For a single moment, everything froze. The air, the sound, the seagulls, the waves. And then it rewound. Not everything, only here, only around the child. 1 second ago, 2, 3, 5. Enough. The child coughed. Water gushed from his little mouth. He opened his eyes and screamed, loudly, demandingly, the way living children scream when they're cold and scared. The mother fell to her knees. She grabbed the child. She pressed him to her chest. She sobbed so hard, her shoulders shook. People around her crossed themselves. Someone whispered about a miracle. Someone stood with their mouth agape. Eli silently put his watch back in his pocket. He stood up. His clothes were wet and heavy. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. He turned and walked away, quickly, almost running, because he'd noticed something. When he'd taken the watch out of his pocket, his hand had flashed before his eyes, and on his temple, on his right temple, there was a strand, white. It hadn't been there that morning when he'd looked in the mirror. He made it to the workshop. He locked the door. He walked over to the mirror above the sink. The strand was there, thin, silvery. Amid his dark hair, it stood out like a crack in a polished watch case. Eli stood there looking at it. He was 19 years old. He remembered what Holzer had said during his first year of training. Every mechanism draws energy from somewhere. A spring draws it from the factory. A pendulum draws it from its swing. Nothing moves on its own. Someone pays for every movement. Eli understood. The watch had taken its toll on him. The child was alive, and he had grown older. By how much? He didn't know. By an hour? By a day? By a week? The strand of hair at his temple didn't answer the question. It simply was there, white, permanent, like a burn scar. He took off his wet clothes, put on dry ones, brewed some tea, sat down at the workbench. His hands were still shaking. He picked up a pair of tweezers and tried to work. His hands settled down after a minute. Muscle memory. Holzer knew what he was doing when he taught him for 12 years straight. As long as his fingers hold the tool, the world makes sense. The world is broken down into parts. Every part has a name. Every malfunction has a cause. Eli worked until dawn. He was repairing a jeweler's pocket watch, and he tried not to look in the mirror. On the fourth day, a man dressed in black came into the workshop. A long coat, a high stand-up collar, gloves. His face was pale and dry as chalk. His eyes were small and alert. He walked in without knocking. He placed a pocket watch in a silver case on the workbench and said it was running 2 minutes slow per day. Eli looked at the watch, then at the man, then back at the watch. A common malfunction, a balance adjustment, a 20-minute job. He picked up the watch, opened the back cover, took out a magnifying glass. The man in black didn't leave. He stood there watching. Eli felt his gaze like a draft on the back of his neck, cold and constant. The man asked how long Eli had been working alone. Eli replied that Master Holzer had passed away 5 days ago. The man nodded. He said he'd heard. He said the master had been a fine craftsman. Eli said nothing. The man asked if anything unusual had happened at the port. Eli said that something unusual happens at the port every day. It's a port. The man didn't smile. He took a small leather-bound booklet out of his pocket. He opened it and showed it to him. On the first page was a seal impression, a cogwheel inside a triangle. Beneath it, an inscription, Chancellery of the Inquisition of the Church of the Ticking Father. Eli's expression didn't change. 12 years of living with Holzer had taught him a lot, including not to show it when everything inside was tightening up. He asked what he could do for him. The man closed the booklet. He put it in his pocket. He said his name was Inquisitor Laurent. He explained that he had arrived in Saint-Maur 3 days earlier on a routine matter. The church had received a report about an incident at the third pier. A child had fallen into the water. He was dead. Then he came back to life. Witnesses' accounts were conflicting, but they agreed on one thing. A young man had placed a certain object against the child's chest and spoken some words. Eli finished adjusting the balance. He closed the watch's case back. He set it on the workbench. He said he'd pulled the child out of the water, that he'd performed CPR, that the people in the crowd saw what they wanted to see, a miracle. But the miracle was simple. The cold water had slowed the heart. Pressure on the chest had restarted it. Laurent stared at him without blinking. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then the Inquisitor took his watch. He turned it over in his fingers. He said that the watch was now running accurately. He said, "Thank you," and he left. Eli stood at the workbench and listened as the footsteps on the stairs faded away. He knew that Laurent didn't believe him. Inquisitors don't believe. That's not their job. Their job is to find and report. And then others come. Those who don't ask questions but hand down sentences. Eli locked the workshop. He took the watch without hands. He wrapped it in a rag. He put it in his tool bag. From that day on, he always carried it with him. It wasn't safe in the workshop. He wasn't safe. A week passed. Laurent didn't return, but Eli saw him twice. Once in the market square, the second time at the entrance to the port hospital. The Inquisitor walked through Saint-Maur and asked questions, quietly, methodically, like a clockwork mechanism. Eli kept working. He repaired watches. He took orders. He ate once a day. He slept 4 hours. The rest of the time, he sat poring over the clock without hands, trying to figure it out. The mechanism wouldn't give in. All the parts were in place. Everything fit perfectly. But the clock was silent. Aside from that one tick on the pier, it hadn't made a sound, as if it needed a reason. At the end of the second week, a woman came into the workshop. She was about 50. Her dress was expensive, but worn. She had once been wealthy, not anymore. She sat down in the customer's chair and, without preamble, said that her father was dying, that he was an 80-year-old man, that the doctors had done everything they could, that she'd heard about the incident at the pier, that she was willing to pay any price. Eli listened. He already knew what he was going to say, but he let her finish. It was important. Holzer had taught him that. When a person brings in a broken watch, they always tell a story. How it fell, how it broke, how they tried to fix it themselves and made it worse. You listen not because you need to hear the story. You listen because the person needs to tell it. The woman finished. She looked at him with hope. That very hope that is worse than despair because you can't turn away from it. Eli stood up. He walked over to her. He asked her to show him her hand. The woman held out her palm. He touched her wrist, and he saw it. Her watch, the transparent mechanism hovering above her. The gears moved smoothly. The mainspring was wound tight. The balance wheel swung without a hitch, a sound mechanism. This woman would live another 20 years if nothing happened. He asked if he could see his father. The woman led him to the house on Upper Street. The old man was lying in bed. He was breathing heavily. His eyes were cloudy. Eli approached. He touched his hand. He saw the old man's watch. And he understood immediately. The mechanism was intact, not a single crack, not a single broken part. The mainspring was almost unwound, its final turns. It wasn't a malfunction, it was the end of its time. The old man was dying his own death, in his own time, just as he should. Eli turned to the woman. He told her he couldn't help. He told her that her father's watch wasn't broken, that he was passing away as he should, that it wasn't a mistake, not an accident, not anyone's fault, that he would live another 3 or 4 days and pass away in his sleep, painlessly. The woman stared at him. The hope in her eyes faded like a candle covered with a snuffer, slowly. She said he was a liar, that he could save a stranger's child on the pier but didn't want to save her father. She said he was a cruel boy playing God. She spat at his feet. Eli wiped his boot on the doormat. He went outside. It was cold out. The wind from the sea carried the smell of salt and fish. He walked back to the workshop, thinking that the woman was right. Not about everything, but about one thing. He really does choose. That's one I'm saving. The other, no. Not because I'm cruel, because one can be fixed, and the other can't. But to the person standing next to you, watching you turn one away, it makes no difference. He walked into the workshop, locked the door, sat down at the workbench, took out the clock without hands, looked at it. The gear that had appeared on its own was still in place, dark, motionless. The watch was silent. He put it back in his pocket. He made some tea, 1 cup. He sat down and drank it. It was getting dark outside the window. 40 clocks on the walls were ticking. He still hadn't taken them down. He couldn't. They were Holzer's clocks. He'd repaired every one of them himself. Each one had a story. A grandfather clock with a chime from the rear admiral's house. A cuckoo clock from the baker's widow. A mantel clock with a lunar calendar. They ticked and reminded him that the master had lived, that he had had hands and patience and 40 years of secrets. Eli finished his tea. He washed the cup. He lay down. He fell asleep, and he woke up to a knock on the door. It was early morning. The light was gray. He opened the door. Father Anselm was standing on the threshold, his face somber. He said they'd found a body at the harbor, a girl, a young one. They'd pulled her out of the water an hour ago. The doctor at the hospital said she'd drowned, but Anselm had seen the body, and it seemed to him that something was wrong with her. He couldn't explain exactly what. He just felt it. Just as he'd once felt in church that a parishioner with bruises was lying about the stairs. Anselm asked Eli to go with him, to take a look. Eli asked why. Anselm replied that he didn't know, but Master Holzer had once told him something strange, that sometimes watches don't break on their own, that sometimes they're broken. Eli put on his coat, he grabbed his bag, and he followed Anselm to the port hospital. The port hospital was a long brick building at the edge of the docks. It smelled of iodine and wet wood. Anselm led Eli through a side door, past the orderly on duty, who knew the former priest and nodded without asking any questions. The body lay in a basement room, on a stone table, covered with a sheet. Eli stopped in the doorway. He had never seen a dead person before, except for Holzer. It was one thing to see an old man who had passed away peacefully. It was quite another to see a young woman who was no more than 20. Anselm stood nearby, silent, waiting. not rushing him. Eli stepped inside. He walked over to the table. He pulled back the sheet. The young woman was thin. Her dark hair was matted from the water. Her face was pale and peaceful. No marks on her neck, no bruises on her arms, nothing that would indicate violence. The doctor was right. It looked like drowning. Eli placed his hand on her forehead. He closed his eyes, and he saw it. Her watch. The mechanism had stopped. The gears were frozen in place. The mainspring was completely unwound. A dead mechanism. But he'd seen dead mechanisms before. Holzer's watch. The child's watch on the pier. The child's watch had a crack in the ratchet. A fluke. Holzer's spring had unwound completely. The end of its life. This was different. Eli peered closely. Something was off. Something was wrong with this mechanism. He couldn't figure out exactly what. Then he saw it. The balance wheel. A small wheel that swings and sets the rhythm. In a dead watch, the balance wheel is motionless. That's normal. But the crack on this girl's balance wheel didn't look like a typical break. A typical crack runs along the grain, random, chaotic, like a fissure in a rock. This crack was smooth, straight, with clean edges, as if someone had run a chisel along the balance wheel, intentionally, precisely, professionally. Eli opened his eyes. Anselm was looking at him. Eli said she hadn't been drowned. He said her watch had been broken. Anselm didn't understand. Eli tried to explain. He said that every person has a mechanism inside them, like a watch. It measures out life. When the mechanism breaks, the person dies. Sometimes the mechanism breaks on its own. Old age, illness, an accident. But this girl's mechanism wasn't broken by accident. The crack was too smooth, too neat. Someone did it on purpose. Anselm was silent for a long time. Then he said that Master Holzer had told him strange things, about clocks that can be repaired, and about clocks that can be broken. He'd thought the old man was speaking in metaphors. It turned out he wasn't. Eli asked if Anselm knew Holzer well. Anselm replied that he visited him once a month. They drank tea, they played chess. Holzer never went to church, but he knew the scriptures better than most priests. And once, when Anselm asked why people die unjustly, Holzer replied, because someone broke the big clock, not the small one, the big one. Eli felt a chill run down his spine. The big clock, the great clock, the mechanism that measured out death justly, which had stopped, because of which children drown while murderers live to be 90. Holzer knew. Of course he knew. He'd lived for 40 years with God's stolen clock in the wall. He understood what was happening to the world, and he remained silent. Eli covered the girl with a sheet. He asked Anselm if anyone knew who she was. Anselm replied that the harbor guard had identified her. Her name was Nella Roy. She worked as a seamstress at a factory on the east side of the harbor. She lived alone, quiet, unobtrusive, no enemies, no debts, an ordinary girl. Factory. Eli latched onto the word. He asked which factory. Anselm replied, Drake's steam-powered factory. Eli didn't know that name. Not yet, anyway. But he remembered it. They left the hospital. The morning was gray and damp. Anselm asked what Eli was going to do. Eli replied that he didn't know. He was a watchmaker, not an investigator, not a police officer. He repaired watches, and this watch couldn't be fixed anymore. The girl was dead. There was no turning back. He hadn't spotted the malfunction in time. He hadn't been there. He hadn't spoken her name. Anselm nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that if someone deliberately breaks other people's watches, they'll do it again. That Nella Roy wouldn't be the last. Eli knew that. But knowing it and accepting it are two different things. He returned to the workshop, sat down at the workbench, took out the watch without hands. He placed it in front of him. For the first time, he looked at it not as a master trying to understand the mechanism, but as a man holding a valuable tool in his hands. This tool could bring back a dead child. It could show the time for a dying old man. It could decipher the broken mechanism of a dead seamstress. He charged a fee for every action. A strand of hair at his temple, a week of life, maybe a month, maybe a year. Eli didn't know the rate. He didn't know how much time he had left. He didn't know if the clock could be stopped. He knew only one thing. There was someone in the world who broke other people's watches. And that someone had a skill, precision, a tool. This wasn't some random madman with a knife. This was a master, another master, who did the same thing Eli did, only the other way around. A knock on the door. Eli put the watch away. He opened the door. A girl was standing on the threshold, about 20 years old, short, uneven black hair, cut with blunt scissors. A men's shirt rolled up to her elbows. Her hands were covered in machine oil. Over her shoulder hung a canvas bag with a wrench sticking out of it. She said she needed to fix a chronometer, a ship's chronometer, an old one, made of brass. The captain had kicked it when he lost at cards, and now the hands were off by half an hour. Eli asked her name. Cora Lindquist, the ship's master's daughter, a mechanic. She walked in, uninvited, set the chronometer on the workbench, looked around, saw 40 clocks on the walls, whistled, said it was like a coffin with music in here. Eli didn't smile, but he thought that this was the first joke he'd heard in the workshop since Holzer died. He picked up the chronometer, opened it, looked inside. The balance spring was bent. A tooth on the anchor wheel was chipped. An hour's work. He got to work. Cora didn't leave. She sat down in the customer's chair and watched him work, silently. That was unusual. Customers usually left and came back for their finished orders. She sat there and watched. 20 minutes later, she said he had a good touch, that only people who respect metal work with it that way. Eli said nothing. After 40 minutes, she asked why he had a gray strand of hair at his temple. He wasn't even 20 yet. Eli said it was from stress. Cora looked at him for a long time. She didn't believe him, but she didn't ask any further questions. An hour later, the stopwatch was ready. Cora took it. She turned it over in her hands. She listened to it ticking. She nodded. She asked how much. Eli named the price. Cora paid. She put the chronometer in her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned around. She said she'd come by tomorrow. She'd bring another one. The captain has 3 of them, and they're all broken. She left. Eli was standing at the workbench. The workshop smelled of machine oil left behind by her hands on the tabletop. A foreign smell. Alive. He thought he should wipe down the table. Then he decided against it. Cora came the next day. She brought the second chronometer. This one was in worse shape than the first. The case was dented. The glass was cracked. Inside were sand and salt. Eli took it apart completely. He washed every part. He replaced the glass with one from Holzer's stock. He straightened the case with a small hammer. Cora sat in the same chair and watched. Half an hour later, she took a sandwich out of her bag. She broke it in half. She placed one half on the edge of the workbench. She didn't say a word. Eli looked at the sandwich, then at Cora. He picked it up. He ate it. It was the first meal anyone had given him in 2 weeks. Not something he'd bought, not something he'd cooked himself. Given to him, just like that. No questions asked, no reason given. He finished the stopwatch by evening. Cora paid. She left. She came back on the 3rd day, without the stopwatch, with a pot of soup. She said she had some left over from yesterday, and that she didn't like eating alone. She put the pot on the stove. She found the plates herself, found the spoons, served the soup. They ate in silence. The soup was hot and thick, with potatoes and onions. A simple dock worker's soup, made from whatever was on hand. Eli ate and thought that the last time he'd eaten like this with someone was when Holzer could still sit at the table, 3 months ago. Cora washed the plates. She dried them, put them away. She looked around. She saw the mantel clock on the workbench with a lunar calendar. She asked what was wrong with it. Eli said the moon disk was sticking. Cora walked over. She looked at it. She said the loop on the moon lever was bent by half a degree, that if they straightened it out and shifted the axis slightly, the disk would turn freely. Eli looked. She was right. He'd been working on this clock for 2 days and hadn't noticed. Cora took her wrench out of her bag. A thin one, a ship's wrench, not a watchmaker's, but her fingers were precise. She straightened the loop in 3 minutes. The moon disk started moving. Eli watched her hands, dirty, covered in oil, with short nails, calluses from wrenches, and absolutely precise. like a surgeon's, or like a watchmaker's. He said she had good hands. Cora smiled. She said he was repeating her own words. They looked at each other. Cora looked away first. She said she'd bring the third chronometer tomorrow. She left. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay on Holzer's bed and thought about the dead seamstress with a straight crack in the balance wheel, about someone who deliberately breaks other people's watches, about Drake's watchmaking workshop. He recalled every detail of what he'd seen in Nella Roy's movement, the crack in the balance wheel, straight, with clean edges, as if made by a tool, but not from a watchmaker's tool. A watchmaker's tool leaves a different mark, finer, more delicate. This crack was rougher, as if made by a machine, an industrial one, a steam-powered one. In the morning, he left the workshop and headed to the port, toward the eastern side, toward the factory. The building was enormous, brick and iron, 3 chimneys, steam billowed in columns. All around, noise and clatter. Workers came and went through the wide gates. Eli walked around the building. Nothing special, an ordinary factory. Machines, boilers, conveyor belts. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a sign that read, "Here, strangers' fates are shattered." There wasn't one. But there was something else. A sign hung by the side entrance. Precision Mechanics Department. Restricted access. For authorized personnel only. Eli stood there for a moment. The door was made of steel. It had a lock he'd never seen before. Not mechanical, not key-operated. Something new. Steam-powered. He took note of it and left. At the gate, a security guard called out to him. He asked what he was doing there. Eli pulled the workshop's business card out of his bag. He said he was looking for clients, that the Vern and Holzer workshop repairs all kinds of watches and timepieces, that a manufactory of this size surely needs a watchmaker for maintenance. The security guard looked at the card. He said the manufactory has its own watchmakers, that there's no need to walk around here, that if he needs a contract, he should write to the... Eli thanked him and left. He was walking back across the market square when he saw a crowd. People were standing all around. Something was happening in the center. He approached. A man was lying on the ground, about 40 years old, in work clothes. His face was ashen. His eyes were closed. A woman with 2 children was standing nearby, crying. Someone in the crowd said that the man had been walking across the square and had fallen. He just fell. For no reason. He'd been healthy. He'd been working since morning. He'd had lunch. He was on his way home, and he fell. Eli pushed his way through the crowd. He dropped to his knees. He touched the man's hand. A watch. He saw it. The mechanism had stopped, and he immediately saw what was wrong. The spring. It had snapped, suddenly, without warning, like a string on a violin. An event. 3 minutes ago. The man was walking across the square. His heart stopped. For no reason. No illness. No warning. It just stopped. Because the great clock isn't working. Because death comes chaotically. Because God has lost his instrument. Eli could have rewound it. The breakdown was fresh. 3 minutes. A snapped spring. He knew the name. The random failure spring. He could have spoken it. The clock would have ticked. The man would have stood up. The children would have stopped crying. And Eli would have paid the price. Another strand of hair. Another week. Maybe 2. He knelt there, looking at the dead man, at the weeping woman, at the children, a boy and a girl, about 8 and 6 years old. The boy wasn't crying. He stood there, holding his sister's hand. His face was stony, just like Eli's had been at 7, when he was told his parents wouldn't be coming back. Eli took out the watch. He held it to the man's chest. He spoke. A random spring malfunction. Tick. The world wavered. 3 minutes ago. The man opened his eyes. He coughed. He sat up. The woman rushed to him. The children swarmed around him on both sides. The crowd buzzed. Someone shouted about a miracle. Someone called for a doctor. Someone crossed themselves. Eli stood up. He put the watch away. He walked away, quickly, through the crowd. His head was spinning. His mouth tasted of iron. He reached the alley. He leaned against the wall. He raised his hand. He looked. Another strand, his left temple, now both. The right one from the child on the pier, the left one from the man in the square. He's 19 years old, and he's going gray like an old man. He stood in the alley and breathed, slowly, deeply, just as Holzer had taught him, when the spring would pop out from under the tweezers and his fingers would start to shake. Breathe, count to 10. Your hands must be steady. A master's hands do not tremble. He counted to 10. His hands steadied. He stepped out of the alley and headed toward the workshop. Halfway there, he stopped, because he saw Laurent. The Inquisitor was standing on the other side of the street. He was looking at him. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't pretending to be passing by. He was just standing there, watching. Their eyes met. Laurent didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't approach him. He just turned and walked away. Eli realized they wouldn't believe him a second time. You can only tell the story about artificial respiration once. 2 identical miracles in front of a crowd within 2 weeks. That's no coincidence. It's a pattern. And the Inquisitors live by patterns. He made it to the workshop. He opened the door. Cora was sitting on the threshold, without a stopwatch, with a pot. She looked at him, at his face, at the gray strands at both temples, at the steely resolve that was probably visible in his eyes. She stood up, opened the door wider, let him in, set the pot on the stove, took out plates. 2, poured the soup. She set them in front of him. He sat down. She sat across from him. They ate. Cora didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask about the second strand of gray hair. She didn't ask why his hands were shaking. She just sat across from him and ate the soup. And that was enough. After the meal, she washed the plates. She turned to him. She said she'd bring that 3rd chronometer tomorrow, and that if he wanted, she could help with the clocks on the walls. Some of them were running slow. She could tell by the rhythm. Eli nodded. Cora left. He sat alone in the workshop. 40 clocks were ticking. Some were indeed running slow. He hadn't noticed, but she had, in just one visit, by the sound. He took out a clock without hands, placed it on the workbench, looked at the dark gear inside. He thought that Holzer had been waiting 40 years, hiding the clock. He'd been looking for someone who could fix it, and he'd chosen the boy who'd put together the mantle clock at the orphanage and hadn't taken a single coin, to fix it, if he could. Eli closed the cover, put the watch in his pocket. He walked over to the first clock on the wall. The mantle clock with the lunar calendar, the very one that Cora had fixed. He listened to its ticking, steady, precise. She hadn't just straightened the loop, she'd adjusted the entire mechanism, with 3 movements, with a ship's wrench. Eli thought the workshop hadn't smelled like this in a long time. Machine oil, soup, someone else's presence, alive. Cora started coming every day. In the morning, she brought bread. In the evening, soup or porridge. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't expect thanks. She just set the food on the table and sat down next to him. Sometimes she helped. Eli gave her small tasks. Clean a mechanism, straighten a case, replace a glass. She worked silently and precisely. Her hands were rougher than a watchmaker's, but her instinct for metal was almost animalistic. She could hear when a gear didn't sit straight on its axle. She could hear when a spring was wound a quarter turn more than necessary. She could hear what most apprentices take years to learn to hear. After a week, Eli realized she wasn't just helping out. She was hiding. Cora never spoke of her father, but one evening, as they sat at the workbench and Eli, was polishing the case of an antique watch, she said she'd run away from home 4 months ago, that her father wanted to marry her off to Tobias Cragg, a steamboat captain, a 50-year-old widower with hands like shovels, and a habit of slapping his wife across the face for undersalted soup. Cragg's first wife had died of pneumonia. Cora said that pneumonia had fists and smelled like gin. Her father knew. Everyone at the port knew, but Cragg paid good money. And a master's daughter is a commodity. Cora left in the middle of the night. She took her clothes and tools. Since then, she'd been living in a tiny room above a warehouse by the western docks. She worked wherever she could. She fixed whatever they asked her to. Ship mechanisms, harbor winches, steam pumps, everything except watches. Watches were too delicate a craft for the port, until she found Holzer's workshop. Eli listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said that the tiny room above the warehouse was a bad place to spend the winter, that there was a second room in the workshop, a small one. It used to be used to store spare parts. He could clear it out. Set up a bed. Cora looked at him. For a long time. She said she didn't need pity. Eli replied that it wasn't pity, that he needed an assistant, that he couldn't pay a full salary, but room and board was a fair deal for the work. Cora thought about it. She nodded. She said she agreed, but if he ever tried to make decisions for her, she'd leave. Eli said that making decisions for others wasn't his specialty. He fixed watches, not people. Cora smiled. It felt like the beginning of something. Not love, not friendship, something in between. A partnership. 2 pairs of hands over a single workbench. That same evening, Eli was tearing down the wall between the workshop and the storage room when there was a knock at the door. He opened it. Standing on the threshold was a man he'd never seen before, about 50 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, gray hair combed back. An expensive suit, but without ostentatious luxury. The fabric was of good. The tailoring was precise. His cufflinks were silver and engraved with small gears, the same as those on the factory's sign. The man introduced himself. Cassius Drake, an industrialist, the owner of a steam-powered factory, a philanthropist in the city of St. Maur. He said he'd heard about the young craftsman who had taken over the late Holzer's business. He said he respected the tradition of apprenticeship, that he himself had started out as a blacksmith's apprentice 30 years ago, that St. Maur needed craftsmen. He walked in. He looked around. He glanced at the 40 clocks on the walls. He smiled. He said that Holzer was an eccentric, that they had known each other, that Holzer had sometimes repaired timepieces for the factory a long time ago, 15 years ago. Then he stopped, without explanation. Eli listened and watched. Drake's hands were steady. His voice was even. His gaze was attentive but not cold. A man accustomed to power, but who hadn't lost his charm. Such people are the most dangerous. They don't pressure you, they envelop you. Drake said he had a proposal. The manufactory needed a full-time watchmaker to service timepieces, to calibrate measuring instruments, a good salary, access to the workshops, the best tools. Eli thanked him. He said he'd think about it. Drake nodded. He took out a business card, placed it on the workbench. Then he left. Cora came out of the storeroom. She had heard everything. She said that Drake was a dangerous man, that people in the port were afraid of him, that his workers didn't talk about what went on inside the factory, that 3 of them had gone missing over the past year. They'd simply stopped showing up. No one looked for them. No one asked about them. Nella Roy worked for Drake. The 3 missing workers were from Drake's factory. Drake came to the workshop 3 weeks after Eli had stopped by his gate. A coincidence, or maybe not. Eli picked up the business card. He twirled it between his fingers. He put it in the workbench drawer. He didn't throw it away. But he didn't accept the offer either. Not yet, anyway. That night, he lay in bed and thought. He knew too little. Someone was breaking other people's watches. Someone with skill and tools. Nella Roy worked for Drake. Drake had come to him himself. But that wasn't proof. It wasn't even evidence. These were coincidences. And coincidences mean nothing in the watch business. A gear either turns or it doesn't. A crack either exists or it doesn't. Conjecture doesn't fix mechanisms. He needed facts, details, names. He fell asleep with the watch without hands in his pocket. It was warm, as always, as if something were smoldering inside. 2 days later, the facts came on their own. Anselm knocked on the door early in the morning. His face was ashen. He said they'd found another body at the docks. A man, around 30 years old. A worker at Drake's factory. Eli grabbed his bag. Cora wanted to go with him. He asked her to stay and take orders. She looked at him with an expression that clearly showed what she thought of his request, but she stayed. At the port hospital, Eli found the body. The doctor wasn't there yet. An orderly let him in at Anselm's request. Eli placed his hand on the dead man's forehead. He closed his eyes. He saw the watch, the stopped mechanism, and a crack on the balance wheel. Even, straight, with sharp edges, identical, the same tool, the same hand, the same craftsman. Eli opened his eyes. He looked at Anselm. He said this was the second murder, committed the same way, by the same person. Anselm asked what to do. Eli said he didn't know, that he was a watchmaker, not a detective, that the only thing he knew how to do was diagnose malfunctions. Anselm was silent for a moment. Then he said he knew someone, a doctor, the only female surgeon in Samurai. She works at this very hospital. She asks questions, lots of questions, and she doesn't believe in miracles. Anselm said that if anyone could help figure out what happened to the bodies, it was her. Eli asked her name. Anselm answered, Dr. Sarah Mendel. Dr. Sarah Mendel was smoking a pipe by the hospital's back entrance. She was short, thin. Her hair was tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. Her lab coat was white, but had stains that wouldn't wash out. Her eyes were dark and tired. The eyes of someone who sees every day what others don't want to see. Anselm introduced them. Sarah looked down at Eli, even though she was half a head shorter than him. She asked if he was the boy who brought the dead back to life on the docks. Eli said he didn't. Sarah took a long drag on her pipe. She exhaled the smoke. She said that the child he supposedly hadn't revived had spent 3 days in the hospital after the incident, that she had examined him, that the boy showed no signs whatsoever of a prolonged stay in the hospital, no pulmonary edema, no hypothermia, no cerebral hypoxia, as if he hadn't drowned at all, or as if someone had rewound his body 5 minutes back in time. She said this calmly, without drama, like a medical observation. Eli replied that he hadn't come to argue about miracles, that the worker's body was lying in the basement, that he wanted Sarah to perform an autopsy, a thorough one, not like the one for Nella Roy, a complete one. Sarah asked why. Eli said he thought the worker had been murdered, but not in the usual way, not with a knife, not with poison, not with bare hands, with something else. Something that leaves no traces on the body. Sarah looked at him, then at Anselm. Anselm nodded. Sarah smashed the phone against the wall. She said she'd perform the autopsy, but in return, Eli would show her how he does what he does. No excuses, no stories about artificial respiration. For real, Eli thought. He nodded. The autopsy took 4 hours. Eli sat in the hallway and waited. Anselm paced back and forth. His massive body moved silently, a habit of a former fighter. Sarah came out in the evening. Her hands were washed. She'd changed out of her lab coat. Her face looked even more tired than she. She sat down next to Eli, lit her pipe, said the body was perfectly healthy. No disease, no poison, no trauma. All organs normal. The heart had stopped, for no reason. It just stopped. She said that in 9 years of practice, she'd seen this happen 3 times. Each time, they'd chalked it up to a heart attack. But a healthy heart doesn't just stop for no reason. A healthy heart beats because it's healthy. That's a tautology, and tautologies don't kill. She looked at Eli, said it was his turn now. Eli led her to the basement, to the body. He placed his hand on the dead man's forehead, closed his eyes, saw the clock, a straight crack on the balance wheel. He opened his eyes. He said he could see the mechanism, the inner one, inside every person, that this man's mechanism had been broken on purpose, that the crack was too straight to be a coincidence, that 2 weeks ago he'd seen an exact same crack on a girl from Drake's factory. Sarah was silent. Her expression didn't change. She asked one question. Could he prove it? Eli said he couldn't, that he saw what he saw, that it wasn't a device, not an analysis, not a study. It's a gift, or a curse. Sarah took a long drag on her pipe. She exhaled the smoke. She said she was a scientist, that she believes only in what can be measured, that gift and curse are words for priests and superstitious old women. But a healthy heart doesn't stop for no reason, and a child doesn't emerge from 10 minutes of drowning without a single injury. She doesn't believe in miracles. But she believes that there are things she doesn't yet understand, and she wants to understand. Eli asked if that meant she would help. Sarah replied that it meant she would observe, study, document, and if he turned out to be a charlatan, she would personally take him to the police for desecrating corpses. Eli said that was fair. They left the hospital. Anselm was waiting at the entrance. Sarah looked at him, then at Eli. She said that the three of them had no evidence whatsoever that anyone was killing the factory workers. No motive, no weapon, no suspect. There were only 2 bodies whose hearts had stopped for no apparent reason, and a boy who claimed to see invisible watches. Anselm said they had something else, a name, Cassius Drake. Both bodies belonged to workers at his factory. Drake came to see Eli in person 3 days after Eli had visited his gate. Sarah asked what Drake wanted from the clockmaker. Eli replied that he didn't know, but that Drake had been looking at the 40 clocks on the workshop walls and smiling, like a man who knows something others don't. They went their separate ways. Sarah returned to the hospital. Anselm went to the port. Eli returned to the workshop. Cora was waiting for him. On the workbench lay 4 watches from customers, all taken apart, each with a diagnosis that Cora had written in small handwriting on slips of paper attached to each movement. Bent anchor, weakened spring, cracked glass, off-balance balance wheel. Everything was correct. Eli checked each diagnosis. Not a single mistake. He looked at Cora. He said she could become a watchmaker, a real one. Cora shrugged. She said a mechanism is a mechanism, a ship's boiler or a pocket watch. The difference is in size. The principle is the same. Forces are transmitted through parts. Parts wear out. A breakdown always occurs at the weakest point. Eli thought Holzer would have said the same thing. In words, but the same thing. At night, he sat at his workbench and thought. 2 bodies, the same handwriting. Drake's manufactory. The precision mechanics department, with the steam-locked chamber. Drake, who came himself and offered the job. Inquisitor Laurent, who walks the streets asking questions. A clock without hands that takes its toll on his life. A world without the great clock, where children drown and murderers live to be 90. Too many details, too few connections. Like a mechanism where half the gears are in place and the other half are scattered across the floor. He doesn't see the whole picture, but he sees the individual details, and he knows that in watchmaking, the most important thing is the order of assembly. You can't install the balance wheel before the mainspring. You can't secure the anchor before the escape wheel. Each part comes after the one before it. First, he'll deal with Drake, then with Laurent, then with the watch. He put away his tools. He blew out the lamp. He lay down. Eli accepted Drake's offer, not because he wanted to work at the manufactory, but because he wanted to get inside. He went to the office. He signed the papers. He received a numbered badge and a pass to the premises. From the inside, the factory was a city within a city. 3 workshops, the foundry, the assembly line, and the packaging area. Hundreds of workers. The steam engines roared so loudly that you could only talk by shouting. The heat from the boilers made the air feel thick. The floor shook from the vibrations. Eli worked in a separate workshop on the 2nd floor, a small room with a workbench and tools. Good tools, better than Holzer's. German steel, Swiss optics, Japanese tweezers. Drake didn't skimp. The work was simple. Chronometers, pressure gauges, measuring instruments, dozens of them a day. Eli repaired them with his eyes closed. That gave him time to observe. For the first 3 days, he simply took it all in. Routes, faces, schedules. Who goes where? Who talks to whom? Who stays silent? Everyone was silent. The workers didn't chatter. They didn't joke. They didn't complain. They worked, they ate, they left. Like machines, like parts of a huge machine. Eli saw this and recognized it. This is how people behave when they're afraid. Not of hunger, not of being fired, of something else. On the 4th day, he tried to make his way to the precision mechanics department. A steel door, a steam-powered lock, a guard in the factory uniform, a big one, with a truncheon on his belt. Eli showed his pass. The guard shook his head. He said a watchmaker had no business here, that access to the precision mechanics department was granted personally by Drake. Eli didn't argue. He left. But he memorized the guard schedule. Shift at 6 in the morning, shift at 6 in the evening. There were 10 minutes between shifts, when the new guard hadn't arrived yet and the old one had already left. 10 minutes. That wasn't much, but it would be enough for a watchmaker. On the 5th day, Eli saw Drake. The industrialist was walking through the workshop accompanied by two men. One was the factory manager. Eli didn't know the other. Short, stooped, wearing glasses with thick lenses. His hands were in gloves, white ones, like a surgeon's or like a watchmaker's. They entered the precision mechanics department. The door closed. Eli stood by the window on the second floor and watched. The man in white gloves, with hands he hides, like a master who knows the value of his fingers. That evening, Eli returned to the workshop. He told Cora and Anselm what he had seen. Cora said that the man in glasses was named Warren Cale, that he had shown up in San Moray half a year ago, that no one knew where he had come from, that the dock workers called him Drake's Shadow, that he never left, that except at night. Anselm added that he'd heard that name from the church archivist. Cale had visited the church library a month ago. He'd asked for access to old texts, to the records of the Watchmakers Guild, and to the manuscripts about the Great Clock. The archivist had refused. Kyle left. But a week later, the archivist discovered that 3 manuscripts had disappeared from the vault. Eli pieced the details together. Kyle, white gloves, the Guild's old texts, the precision mechanics department, cracks in the balance wheels of the dead workers, even, as if made by a machine, a steam-powered industrial. Drake doesn't break other people's clocks himself. He has a master, and that master has a machine. On the 6th day at the factory, Eli waited for the guard shift to change. At 2 minutes to 6 in the evening, he went down to the first floor. He walked past the workshop. He reached the steel door. The guard had already left. There was no new one yet. A steam lock. Eli examined it. Complex. 3 cylinders, steam pressure through a valve, a combination lock. He didn't know the combination, but he knew steam mechanisms. Holzer considered them crude work, but he taught him how to take them apart too, because a master must know everything that ticks. Eli took a thin probe out of his bag. He inserted it into the gap between the cylinders. He listened. The steam hissed. Each cylinder hissed differently depending on its position, just as a gear sounds different on different teeth. He turned the first cylinder. The hiss changed. It grew higher. He turned the second, even higher. The third, a click. The lock opened. 4 minutes. He had 6 left. He stepped inside. It was dark. It smelled of metal and something else, something familiar. The smell he'd sensed when he held the watch without hands to his chest. The smell of time. He lit a match. The room was small. A workbench, tools, blueprints on the walls, and the machine. It stood in the center on a stone pedestal, about the size of a large chest, copper and steel, pipes and valves, a steam boiler on the side, and in the center, the mechanism. Eli held the match closer. The mechanism resembled that of a watch. Gears, springs, an anchor, but enlarged, rough, industrial. And at the end of the mechanism was a cutter. Thin, made of a metal Eli didn't recognize, the same metal from which the parts of the watch without hands were made. He understood. It was a machine for creating cracks. Steam power drove the mechanism. The mechanism guided the cutter. The cutter carved a crack into the balance wheel of someone else's watch, of someone else's fate. He didn't know how. He didn't know what principle allowed the machine to reach the invisible mechanism inside a person, but he knew it was possible, because he'd seen the result. 2 bodies with identical cracks. The match had burned out. He lit a second one. He grabbed the first blueprint he could find off the wall. He rolled it up, tucked it into his shirt. He turned around, and saw a silhouette in the doorway. Short, stooped, wearing thick-lensed glasses. Warren Cale stood in the doorway and looked at him. Silently. The match had burned out. Darkness. Cale didn't scream. He didn't call security. He walked into the room. He closed the door behind him. He lit the gas lamp on the wall. The light was yellow and dim. Cale stood between Eli and the door. His hands, clad in white gloves, were folded across his chest. His eyes, behind the thick lenses, were calm, even curious. He said he knew who Eli was. Not a watchmaker looking for contracts, but that very same boy from the port. The one who holds a pocket watch up to the dead and speaks the words. The one with graying temples. He said he'd been watching him since his first day at the factory. Eli remained silent. His hands didn't tremble. The blueprint, tucked under his shirt, pressed against his ribs. Kyle walked over to the machine. He ran his glove over the copper casing, as if it were a living creature, gently. He said he'd built it in 4 months, that he'd taken the blueprints from the guild's stolen manuscripts, that the guild had known, a long time ago, as far back as 300 years, that the clock inside a human being could not only be read and repaired, it could be broken, intentionally, exactly, if you know how it works, if you have the right tools. The guild banned this knowledge, destroyed all records, almost all of them. 3 manuscripts survived in a church vault, forgotten, of no use to anyone. Until Kale came along. Eli asked why. Kale looked at him, smiled, said that Eli was asking the wrong question. Not why, but for whom? Drake. Everything for Drake. Eli asked what Drake wanted. Kale said that Drake wanted to live, forever. That Drake is 62 years old, not 50 as he looks. That he's paying Kale to find a way to stop his clock, not to break it, to stop it, to freeze it, so the hands wouldn't move, so the spring wouldn't unwind, so death would pass him by. But Kale hasn't found a way, not yet. He's only found the opposite, a way to break it. The factory workers were his test subjects. Nella Roy, the man from the docks, 3 others before them. Kale broke their watches to understand the mechanism, to figure out the principle, to gain control through destruction. 5 people, 5 dead bodies, all for the sake of one old man who was afraid to die. Eli stood there and listened. Something was rising inside him, not anger. Holzer had taught him not to get angry at breakdowns. Anger clouds your vision. This was something else, cold, clear, understanding. Kale was a master, a true one, not like Eli. Kale didn't have the gift of seeing other people's watches. He worked blindly, by blueprints, by calculations, by formulas. He was an engineer, not a watchmaker. And that's exactly why he killed, because he didn't see what he was doing. Because to him, people were mechanisms, and mechanisms can be taken apart. Eli asked why Kale was telling him all this. Kale took off the glove from his right hand. He showed him. His fingers were black, from the tips to the second phalanx, like they were frostbitten, like they were dead. Kale said that the machine takes its toll, just like Eli's watch. Every broken life takes a piece from the master. Fingers, hands, soon elbows, then shoulders. He's dying, slowly, piece by piece. Drake promised he'd find a cure, that money would solve everything. But there's no cure, and Kale knows his time is running out. He said he saw how Eli brought the child back. Not in person, just from what he heard. But he understood right away. Eli has something Kale doesn't. A gift, a real one, innate, not learned from blueprints. Kale said that Eli could fix his hands, undo the damage, restore his fingers, if he wants to. In exchange, Kale will tell him everything he knows about Drake, about his plans, about the machine, about the manuscripts. Eli stared at his blackened fingers. He saw Kale's watch. He shouldn't have touched it. The mechanism was visible anyway, corrupted, not broken, corrupted. Like a watch that keeps running, but every tick poisons the mechanism. Rust was creeping across the gears, slowly, unstoppable. It wasn't a malfunction, it was the price. Like the gray strands in Eli's hair, only worse. Eli could back out, theoretically, find a replacement part, say the name, give Kyle his hands back. But that meant saving a man who had killed 5 people, who had built a killing machine, who had broken other people's watches on the orders of a man thirsting for immortality, and pay for it with his own life. One more strand of gray, one more week, maybe a month. Eli said no. Kyle looked at him. His expression didn't change, as if he'd been expecting that answer. He nodded, said he understood, said that if he were in Eli's shoes, he'd have answered the same way. Then he said that in that case, Eli had to leave, right now, through the side exit, before he changed his mind and called security. Eli walked toward the door, stopped. He turned around. He asked one thing: where Drake kept the machine's blueprints. The complete set. Not the stolen manuscripts, but his own notes. Cale was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said, "In the safe in my office, behind the portrait of my wife. The combination is the date of her death, March 12th. Eli nodded. He went out. He walked down the dark corridor of the factory, past the dormant machines, past the cooled-down boilers. His heart beat steadily. His hands didn't tremble. He went out through a side door into the alley. The night air smelled of the sea and coal. He reached the workshop. Cora was awake. She was sitting at the workbench, repairing a cuckoo clock. She looked at him. She said he looked as if he'd been to hell. Eli said it was probably warmer in hell. There were drafts at Drake's factory. Cora didn't smile. She asked what he'd found. He pulled a blueprint from his coat. He spread it out on the workbench. Cora leaned in. She looked at it for a long time. She didn't understand what it was, but she could see the design. A steam drive, a transmission mechanism, and a cutting tool at the end. She said it looked like an engraving machine, only it was strange. The cutting tool was too thin for metal, and the material it was made of was unfamiliar. Eli said it wasn't an engraving machine, that it was a killing machine. That Drake and his master were using this machine to ruin people's lives, literally. Cora was silent. Then she stood up. She walked over to the stove. She put the kettle on. She took out 2 cups. Eli watched her, her back, clad in a men's shirt, her short, uneven hair, her hands moving calmly and precisely, as if the world weren't falling apart, as if tea could fix anything. And maybe she was right. In the morning, Eli went to see Anselm. The former priest lived in a small room above a bakery in the old neighborhood. 1 bed, 1 table, a shelf with books, a crucifix on the wall. The simple life of a man who had lost everything and didn't complain. Eli placed the blueprint on the table. He told him everything. Cale, the car, 5 dead bodies, Drake, immortality. Anselm listened in silence. His hands were folded in his lap, huge hands. Hands that once broke jaws in dockyard brawls and now turned the pages of scripture. When Eli finished, Anselm was silent for a moment. Then he said that the Church of the Ticking Father teaches that death is a gift, that it comes in due time, that to argue with it is to argue with God. He said he had been excommunicated for doubting this, for asking aloud why the gift comes to 10-year-old girls but not to murderers until they are 90. He was told that God's ways are inscrutable. He replied that inscrutability is not an answer but a refusal to answer. He was expelled within a week. Now he faced another question, a machine that undoes another's death, a man who wants to steal immortality, and a boy with God's watch in his pocket who can repair what has been broken. Anselm said there is a line in Scripture, a watchmaker does not repair the world. He repairs 1 watch, then the next, then the next. The world repairs itself when enough watches have been repaired. Eli asked what that meant in practice. Anselm smiled, for the first time that morning. He said that in practice, it meant they couldn't destroy Drake's factory. They couldn't go to the police. They couldn't tell the city that the industrialist was killing workers with an invisible machine. No one would believe them. They'd be locked up, or worse. But there was one thing they could do. Take the blueprints. That's all. Without the blueprints, Cale wouldn't be able to fix the machine if it broke down. Without the blueprints, Drake wouldn't be able to build a new one. It wasn't a solution. It was a delay. But in the clock business, a delay is time, and time is everything. Eli nodded. They came up with a plan, a simple one. Eli knew the layout of Drake's office. He knows the safe is behind the portrait of Drake's wife. He knows the code, March 12th. He'll come at night, take the blueprints, leave. Cora said she'd go with him. Eli said no. Cora said she knew the factory better than he did, that she'd worked at the nearby docks for 2 years, that she knew every passageway and every pipe, that without her, he'd get lost in the dark and get caught by the guards. Eli looked at her face, at the stubborn crease between her eyebrows that appeared every time someone tried to tell her what to do. He remembered he'd promised not to make decisions for her. He nodded. Anselm said he'd wait by the side exit. If anything went wrong, he'd distract the guards. Eli asked how. Anselm said he was a former dock worker weighing 100 kilograms, that distracting people was a matter of motivation, not method. Sarah found out about the plan that evening. She came to the workshop. She smoked a pipe. She listened. She said they were all crazy, that breaking into the office of the richest man in Samurai wasn't a plan, it was suicide. Then she paused and said that if any of them got hurt, she'd be waiting at the hospital, with thread and needles. And if Eli died, she wanted to perform an autopsy on him, for science. Eli said he'd try not to die for the sake of her scientific curiosity. Sarah didn't smile, but her eyes softened a little. They set out at night, the third shift. The factory operated around the clock, but at night, the administrative wing was empty. Cora led the way, through a side passage, past the warehouses, up the stairs to the third floor. She moved through the darkness like a cat, silently, confidently. Eli followed her, thinking that 12 years of training in watchmaking hadn't prepared him for nighttime infiltrations into other people's offices. Drake's office was at the end of the hallway. The door was wooden. The lock was simple. Eli opened it in 30 seconds, a lockpick from a watchmaker's kit. Holzer always said that a good tool is versatile. It was dark inside. It smelled of tobacco and leather. Cora lit a candle. The office was large, a mahogany desk, an armchair, cabinets full of papers, and a portrait on the wall. A woman, young, beautiful, with sad eyes. Drake's wife, deceased, March 12th. Eli took down the portrait. Behind it was a safe, metal, with a combination lock. 4 digits, 1203, March 12th. The lock clicked. The door opened. Inside was a folder, thick, leather. Eli took it out. He opened it. Blueprints, dozens of sheets, machine schematics, calculations, formulas, and something else. 3 old manuscripts, stolen from the church vault, yellowed pages with handwritten text, in the guild's language. Eli recognized some of the symbols, the same ones on the lid of the clock without hands. He took everything, locked the safe, hung the portrait. Cora blew out the candle. They left the study, walked back down the hallway, down the stairs, past the storage rooms, to the side exit. Anselm was waiting in the alley, a huge shadow against the wall. They went out, walked away quickly. Behind them, the factory hummed with steam engines. No one noticed. No one called out to them. They reached the workshop. Eli placed the folder on the workbench. He opened it. He laid out the blueprints. Cora watched them. Anselm stood nearby. Eli took the guild manuscripts, 3 documents, old, worn. He began to read. The language was archaic but understandable. Holzer had taught him to read old texts. He said that a master must know the history of his craft. The first manuscript described the inner workings of the human clock, in detail, with diagrams. Every detail, every function. The balance wheel is the rhythm of life. The mainspring is the reserve of time. The anchor is willpower. The pendulum is habits. The escape wheel is attention. The escape is moments of choice. The second manuscript described methods of repair, manual repair, reading. Everything Eli already knew, but in greater detail, with details he hadn't known before, and with warnings. Every setback steals the master's time. A minor breakdown, an hour. A moderate one, a day. A serious one, a week. Salvation from the death that was supposed to change the course of history, a month or a year. The third manuscript described the Great Clock, a mechanism created by the clockmaker god 1,000 years ago. A mechanism that measured out death justly, one that stopped when it was stolen. The manuscript did not name the thief, but Eli already knew. Holzer, 40 years ago, for his wife's sake. He read until dawn. Cora fell asleep in a chair. Anselm left around midnight. Eli sat alone, poring over the manuscripts, and felt the world around him shifting shape. He wasn't just some random boy who'd found a magical clock. He was a link in the chain. Holzer had chosen him. The clock had recognized him. The gear had appeared on its own. All of this was part of something bigger, something that ticked beyond his understanding. He closed the manuscripts. He put them away in a black wooden case, along with the clock without hands. He walked over to the mirror. Gray strands at both temples, dark circles under his eyes, a gaunt face. He was 19. But the reflection looked back at him with the eyes of a man well past 20. He thought of Drake. In the morning, Drake would discover that the safe was empty. He'd realize who had done it. Drake had money, power, security, the police, half the city. And Eli has a clock without hands, the guild's manuscripts, the workshop on the waterfront. Cora, who's sleeping in a chair. Anselm, who's waiting in the dark. Sarah, who doesn't believe in miracles but is preparing thread and needles. It's not enough, but it's all he has. Drake found out by noon. Eli had been expecting this. He just hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. 2 men came into the workshop. Not security guards. Worse, men in nice suits, with expressionless faces. One stood by the door. The other placed Drake's business card on the workbench. On the back, it was written by hand, "Tonight, my office. Bring what you took." No card, no signature, no threat. Drake didn't threaten. He was inviting them, as if it were a business dinner. The men left. Cora stood against the wall with a wrench in her hand. She'd grabbed it when they came in, a dockworker's reflex. Eli took the card, read it, put it in his pocket, told Cora he'd go to Drake's that evening, alone. Cora said he was an idiot, that Drake would kill him, or put him in jail, or hand him over to the Inquisition, or all of the above. Eli said Drake wouldn't kill him, because Drake doesn't need the blueprints. He can reconstruct the blueprints. Cale remembers them. Drake needs Eli, his gift, his ability to see the gears and fix them. Cale's machine breaks things blindly. Eli sees. The difference between a blind engineer and a sighted master is the difference between an axe and a scalpel. Drake wants a scalpel. Cora was silent. Then she asked what he was going to do. Eli said he'd go and listen, that a master first listens to how the mechanism ticks, then decides what to fix. He came to Drake's office that evening. The room was lit. The portrait of his wife hung in its usual place. The safe behind it was locked, as if nothing had happened. Drake was sitting at the desk. In front of him stood a decanter of cognac and 2 glasses. He poured both. He pushed one toward Eli. Eli didn't sit down. He didn't take the glass. He stood by the door. The watch without hands in his pocket was warm. Drake spoke, calmly, like a man accustomed to negotiating. He said he wasn't angry, that the theft was an act of initiative, and he liked initiative, that he'd been looking for the Watchmaker for 20 years, that he'd sent Kyle to track down the guild, that Kyle had found the manuscripts, built the machine, but the machine was crude, blind, inaccurate. It could break things but couldn't fix them, and Drake needed a fix, his own. He said he was 62 years old, that his heart was failing, that the doctors gave him 5 years, maybe 3. He built half of Sam Moore, gave jobs to thousands. He lifted the city out of the mud, and for that, fate is giving him 5 years? It's not fair. He said that Eli could change that, could look at his watch, find the malfunction, fix it, turn back the clock, give him another 20 years, or 30. In exchange, Drake would give him everything. Money, protection from the Inquisition, a workshop 10 times bigger, the best tools in the world, protection for his friends, for Cora, for Anselm, for everyone. Eli listened. Then he said he wanted to see it. Drake nodded. He held out his hand. Eli touched his wrist. He saw Drake's watch, the mechanism, large, powerful, gears made of fine metal, a strong spring, but worn out, not broken, worn out. Like the old man's on the street above that woman's father's house. The spring was unwinding, slowly, but unstoppably. It wasn't a malfunction, it was the end of its life. Eli let go of his hand. He looked Drake in the eyes. He said that his watch wasn't broken, that the spring was worn out, that it wasn't a mistake, not an accident, not anyone's fault, that it was dying its own death, that Eli couldn't fix what wasn't broken. Drake looked at him. The cognac in the glass was trembling. His hand was trembling. For the first time during the entire conversation, he said that Eli was lying, that if a child in the sewer could be saved, then he could be saved too, that the only difference was the price, and he was willing to pay any price. Eli said it wasn't about the price, that the child had died because of a malfunction, because of a crack in the ratchet, a coincidence, a mistake, a malfunction. It can be undone, because it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Drake is dying because time has run out, because the spring has unwound, because that's how the mechanism works. That can't be undone, because that's how it's supposed to be. Drake stood up, slowly. He braced his fists against the table. His face flushed. His voice grew quiet, quieter than before. He said that in that case, Eli was useless, that he didn't care about the blueprints, that Kale would restore them in a week, that he'd find another way, that he'd buy immortality from anyone, from the guild, from the church, from God himself, and he'd destroy Eli. Not kill him, destroy him. He'd set the Inquisition on him. He'll set the police on him. He'll tell the whole city that the boy from the workshop on the waterfront is a sorcerer and a heretic. He'll burn down the workshop. He'll throw his friends out onto the street, and he'll watch. Eli stood there and listened. Inside, he felt empty. Not scary, empty, like a clock without hands, the silence between the ticks. He turned and walked out. Drake didn't stop him. Anselm and Cora were waiting in the alley. Cora asked what had happened. Eli said that they were now Drake's enemies, that they might have a week. Anselm asked what to do. Eli said that in the guild's manuscripts he had read about the missing parts of the god's clock, that a clock without hands is incomplete, that they needed one more gear, that the manuscript pointed to a location, an old monastery in the north, looted, abandoned. The second part is hidden there. If they find it and insert it into the mechanism, the clock will be closer to completion. And the completed god's clock is not just a tool for rollbacks. It is a key to the great clock, to setting the world right. Anselm asked how far away it was. Eli said 3 days north, on horseback. Cora said she'd get the horses. They set out into the night. They rode for 3 days. Cora got 2 horses from the harbor stable hand, old nags, but sturdy. Anselm stayed in Saint-Maurice to guard the workshop, and Midori. The girl showed up the day before they left. She came in the morning. She sat silently on the threshold, soaked from the rain, with no belongings, no explanation. Cora brought her inside, gave her dry clothes, gave her food. Midori ate greedily, like someone who hadn't eaten in 3 days. When Eli asked where she had come from, Midori didn't answer. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark, large, adult eyes on a child's face. She was 17 but looked 14, thin, silent, like a shadow. Eli touched her shoulder and saw the watch, small, fast. The gears were spinning at breakneck speed. The spring was wound to the limit. The mechanism was working but on its last legs, like a person who's been running for a long time and can't stop. And something else. Midori had seen his watch. He could tell by her eyes, by the way she wasn't looking at him but slightly above him, where his watch was hovering. She had seen it, faintly, blurrily, like someone who can make out the letters but can't read the word, but she saw it. He left her with Anselm. He said he'd be back in a week. He told Anselm that Midori was special, that he needed to keep an eye on her. Anselm nodded. For him, looking after someone was as natural as breathing. 3 days on horseback. The road led north through the hills, past villages, past fields, past forests. Cora rode alongside and said nothing. She knew how to be silent. It was a rare quality. Most people fill the silence with words. Cora filled it with her presence. She was there. That was enough. On the second night, they stopped at a roadside tavern. Small, dirty, crooked walls, a soot-stained ceiling. Behind the counter stood a one-eyed old man. They took a room, just one. Cora said it was cheaper. Eli didn't argue. Cora lay down on the bed. Eli sat down at the table. He took out the manuscripts and read by candlelight. The third manuscript, about the great clock. There was a description. The god's clock was assembled from 7 parts. Each part corresponded to one of the aspects of death: the gear of justice, the gear of compassion, the gear of memory, the gear of acceptance, the gear of forgiveness, the gear of letting go, and the last one, the gear of sacrifice. The first one appeared in the clock on its own, not shortly after Holzer's funeral, the gear of memory, Because Eli remembered. He remembered the master. He remembered 12 years. He remembered the smell of oil and tea. The clock recognized this and accepted him. The second gear is hidden in a monastery. The manuscript didn't say which one. 5 remained, scattered across the continent. Each one must be found. Each one must be earned. Not by force, not by cunning, by understanding. The master must understand what each detail means before it falls into place. Holzer had been searching for 40 years. He hadn't found a single one after the first, because he was searching for himself, for his wife's sake, out of guilt. The clock does not accept a master who repairs it for himself. Eli closed the manuscript. He looked at Cora. She was asleep. Her face was relaxed, without that stubborn crease between her brows. In her sleep, she looked her 20 years, no older. He thought that her father was dying, that Cora hadn't been with him since she left, 4 months, that the old man was sick, that Cora knew and was keeping quiet, that she was silent not because she didn't care, but because the pain was too great for words. He thought that when they returned, he would take her to her father, and he would fix the old man's watch. Not the inner workings, the ordinary one, the pocket watch, the one he'd carried his whole life, the one his wife had given him, Cora's mother. Sometimes, to fix a person, you don't need a gift. You just need a craftsman with skilled hands and patience. The monastery stood on a hill above the river. The walls were gray. The roof had caved in. The windows were empty. The gates had been torn from their hinges. It had been ransacked 20 years ago. The monks had left. Looters had carried off everything of value: icons, silver, books, furniture. Only stone and silence remained. Eli and Cora went inside. A long corridor, cells on either side, empty, dust, cobwebs, the smell of dampness and moss. At the end of the corridor was a chapel, small, round, with a dome that had a hole in it. Light streamed down from above in a beam. In the center of the chapel stood a pedestal, made of stone. There was nothing on it. Eli approached. He dropped to his knees. He placed his hands on the stone. He closed his eyes. Nothing. Silence. Emptiness. He concentrated, like over a clock mechanism. Listen to the silence between the ticks. The answer is there. 1 minute, 2, 5, and then he heard it. A tick, faint, distant, as if from beneath the ground. He opened his eyes. He looked at the pedestal, ran his fingers over the stone, felt a crack, thin, like a hair. He took a tool out of his bag, the same tweezers he'd used to repair his pocket watch. He inserted them into the crack, pressed. The stone shifted. Beneath it was a niche, small. Inside lay a gear, dark, warm, exactly like the first one. He picked it up and felt it. It was vibrating, quietly, like a mechanism waiting. He took the watch without hands out of his pocket. He opened the back cover, the second compartment, empty. He held the gear up to it. It slid into place on its own, effortlessly, like a finger into a glove. The watch ticked once, twice, 3 times, then it stopped. But now it had 2 gears, 2 out of 7. Cora stood at the entrance to the chapel and watched. She didn't see what he saw, but she heard the ticking, and she saw his face. She said his eyes glowed, for a single second, like coals. Eli put the clock away. He stood up. He said they'd found what they were looking for. Cora asked what was next. Eli replied that next they'd go home, to the workshop, to the people. He thought of Drake, of Lauren, about Kayla with the black fingers, about the machine that shatters other people's fates. He thought that all of this was still waiting for him in Samurai, but now he had 2 prongs out of 7. That wasn't enough to fix the world, but it was enough not to be afraid. They returned to Samurai on the 6th day. The workshop was still standing, intact. Anselm met them at the door. His face was grim. He said that Drake had begun to act, not on his own, through the Inquisition. Laurent had received a report, a detailed one, describing every single incident. The child on the pier, the man in the square, the young master with graying temples and a pocket watch without hands, a heretic, a sorcerer, an enemy of the ticking father. The Inquisition had issued an arrest warrant. Eli listened. Midori sat in the corner of the workshop, cleaning gears. Small ones, ordinary ones, from Holzer's box of spare parts. She did it carefully, meticulously. She wiped each part with a separate cloth. She arranged them in a row, by size, by type, as if she'd been doing this her whole life. Eli walked over to her. He sat down beside her. He asked if she knew how to assemble a watch. Midori didn't answer. She picked up a disassembled pocket watch movement from the table and began to put it together. Her fingers moved slowly but surely, every part in its place, every gear on its axle. 10 minutes later, the watch was assembled. Not perfectly. The anchor was slightly askew. The spring was wound a quarter turn too far. But for someone with no training, it was as good as it could get. Eli asked how she knew. Midori looked up. She looked at him, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, like that of someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. She said she could see. That she had always seen. That she could see how the gears were supposed to sit. That they glowed when they were positioned correctly and dimmed when they were crooked. She said she had seen her brother's watch, her little brother, 3 years old. She saw a gear inside it crack. She saw it and couldn't help. Because she didn't know the name, didn't know the word. She saw the malfunction but couldn't name it. Her brother died in her arms. She was 12. She fell silent. Eli was silent too, for a long time. Then he said he'd teach her, not strength, not a gift, a craft, the names of the parts, the language of breakdowns, the very thing Holzer had drilled into him for 12 years. Midori nodded. Her eyes were dry. She'd forgotten how to cry before Eli did. There was a knock at the door. Sarah, with news. She said that Cale was dead. They'd found him that morning on the factory grounds. His heart had stopped. His hands were black up to his elbows, just as she'd expected. The machine had taken him whole. Sarah said something else, that before he died, Cale had come to the hospital. At night, he knocked on the back door. He asked her to give Elijah an envelope. Sarah handed over the envelope, dirty, crumpled. Inside was a letter, short handwriting, jumping letters, written with black fingers. Cale wrote that the machine had been destroyed, that he'd broken it himself, that it was the only thing he could do right, that Drake was building a new one, but without the blueprints and without Cale, it would take months. He wrote that there was another test subject in the factory basement, alive, locked up, a worker Drake was keeping for experiments. His name was Theo Mert. He didn't have much time left. Eli placed the letter on the table. He looked at Cora, at Anselm, at Sarah, at Midori. 5 people in the workshop, 5 pairs of eyes. He said he was going after Theo Mert. Anselm said the Inquisition was looking for him, that it was dangerous out on the streets. Sarah said it was a trap, that Drake was waiting for him. Cora didn't say anything. She just stood up. She put on her coat. She took a wrench from the workbench drawer. It was heavy, a ship's wrench. She looked at Eli. He understood. They set out at night, just the 2 of them, through the docks, past the warehouses, toward the factory. Cora knew another entrance, through the sewer tunnel under the east wing. Narrow, wet, smelly. They made their way through. They emerged in the basement. Darkness. The smell of dampness and machine oil. Cora struck a match. A long corridor. Doors on either side. All were open. Empty rooms. Except for one. The last one. Locked. Eli unlocked the door. A simple lock. Mechanical. Inside, a man lay on the floor. Thin. Pale. Eyes closed. Breathing. Barely. Theo Mert. Eli touched his hand. He saw the watch. The mechanism was barely moving. The spring was almost unwound, but not from age. His watch was damaged. Countless tiny cracks, all over the mechanism, as if Kyle's machine had been working on it over and over again, without breaking it completely, testing, trying, fine-tuning. Eli saw every crack, dozens of them. Each one was a separate pain. Each one was an experiment. He could back out. But dozens of cracks meant dozens of names, dozens of ticks, dozens of weeks of his life, or months. He could die right here, on the dirty floor of the basement at Drake's factory. Cora stood nearby, silent, watching, waiting, not rushing him. She didn't tell him what to do, because she knew. It was his decision, his alone. Eli closed his eyes. He thought of Holzer, of the rule the old man had drummed into him for 12 years. You are not a god. You are a servant of what already exists. Then he thought of the child on the pier, about the man in the square, about the boy who stood there, holding his sister's hand with a stony face. He couldn't undo it all, but he could try to fix it. Not by undoing it, by hand, like a master, slowly, piece by piece, crack by crack. No ticks, no payment, just his hands and his tools. He took a kit out of his bag, thin screwdrivers, tweezers, probes. He took out the watch without hands, held it to Theo's chest, saw the mechanism, and began to repair it by hand. Inside the floating, transparent mechanism, crack by crack, piece by piece. It took 4 hours. Cora stood nearby, holding a candle, motionless. 4 hours. Her hand didn't waver once. When he finished, Theo opened his eyes. He looked at them, confused. Cora helped him stand up. They led him through the tunnel, through the docks, into the workshop. Sarah was waiting, with thread and needles, and with broth. Theo drank the broth and cried, silently, without a sound, just tears streaming down his cheeks. Eli sat at the workbench. His hands were shaking. For the first time in 4 hours, he looked in the mirror. Not a single new strand. Manual repairs didn't charge a fee, just time and exhaustion. And 4 hours of his life spent on the dirty basement floor with tweezers in his hand. But it was a fair price. The price of a craftsman, not a god. Drake died 3 days later, of natural causes, just as Eli had said. The spring unwound. His heart stopped. In the morning, at breakfast, with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was sitting in his study, at a mahogany desk, beneath a portrait of his wife with sad eyes. The coffee was still steaming when the servant found him. All of Samor attended the funeral. Half the town wept. The other half remained silent. The flags at the factory were flown at half-mast. The steam engines stopped for the first time in 11 years. Silence hung over the docks like fog, unfamiliar, heavy. Eli didn't go to the funeral. He stood by the workshop window and watched the procession move along the waterfront. Long, black, with torches. Leading the way was a priest from the cathedral, not Anselm, a real one, an active one, in golden vestments. Behind him they carried the coffin, an oak one, with brass handles. Behind the coffin walked the factory workers, hundreds of them, in clean shirts, with their heads uncovered. Many were crying, sincerely. Drake built half of this city. He gave work to thousands of people. He fed families. He developed the port. He funded a school for the workers' children. He repaired the waterfront after the storm 3 years ago. And he killed 5 workers with an invisible machine. And he kept a 6th one in the basement. The world isn't divided into black and white. It's divided into gears that turn the right way and gears that turn the wrong way. And a single gear can be both, depending on which side you're looking from. Cora stood nearby. She looked out the same window. She was silent. Then she said that her father had once worked for Drake, a long time ago. When the shipyard was just being built, Drake personally helped him get his shipwright's license. He lent him money, interest-free, no IOU. He just helped him. And then he wanted to give his daughter to a steamship captain who beat his wives. Cora said that people aren't all the same, that it's tiresome, but it's true. Eli nodded. After Drake's funeral, the Inquisition didn't back down. Lauren kept searching. The warrant was still valid. Drake was dead, but the report remained. A piece of paper doesn't die with the person who signed it. Lauren walked around Samor and asked questions. At the grocer's on the next street, at the widow's apartment upstairs, at the harbor guards, at the mother of the child Eli had saved at the dock. Every day, the net was closing in. Eli could feel it, just as you feel a spring being wound to its limit. Just a little more, and it would snap. He decided not to wait. He went out to find Laurent himself. He found him at a hotel near the market square, a small room on the 3rd floor, a narrow bed, a table, a stack of papers, an inkwell, a quill. Laurent lived like a monk, nothing superfluous, nothing of his own, only work. Eli walked in, sat down across from him. Laurent looked at him, small, attentive eyes in a pale, gaunt face. A man accustomed to finding and reporting, who never raises his voice because a quiet voice is heard more attentively. Eli said he was ready to show him everything. No deception, no stories about artificial respiration, for real, but not to Laurent. To the church. If the church sends someone who has the right to judge, not just someone who has the right to report. Laurent was silent for a long time. The pen in his hand didn't move. The stack of papers lay untouched. Then he said that this was a breach of protocol, that inquisitors report, not judge, that a bishop is needed for a trial, that the bishop is in the capital, that it would take months. Eli said he would wait, that he wasn't going anywhere, that the workshop on the waterfront was open every day from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, that he repaired clocks, ordinary clocks, pocket watches, wall clocks, mantle clocks, that if the Inquisition wanted to arrest him, they knew the address. Laurent looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, the expression on his face changed. Not much, just a little, like a hand that had shifted by a single tick. Something in his eyes softened. Not warmer, softer. The way it is when a person who has followed the rules all his life sees, for the first time, someone who follows not the rules, but something greater. He nodded. He said he'd write to the capital, and he added one thing. He said that 3 weeks ago in the square, when the man fell and Eli helped him up, Laurent had been standing on the other side of the street. He'd seen everything. And the moment the man opened his eyes, Laurent saw it too. Not the clock. Not a mechanism, something else, a light, brief, like a flash, like a spark from flint. He said he'd served the Inquisition for 20 years, that he'd seen hundreds of charlatans and liars, that none of them had glowed. Eli stood up. He went outside. It was cool out on the street, a spring breeze from the sea, the smell of salt and wet stone. Cora was waiting around the corner, of course. She was always waiting, with a wrench in the right pocket of her coat, just in case she had to drag him out by force. He said that Laurent hadn't arrested him. Cora said that if he had been arrested, she would have come in with the wrench. Eli almost smiled. Weeks went by. The workshop was busy. Orders were coming in more frequently. After Drake's death, the factory had ground to a halt. Half the craftsmen had left. People had nowhere else to take their broken chronometers and instruments. They came to Eli. The workbench was piled high. Cora worked from morning till night. Midori helped, slowly but surely. Every evening, Eli would sit down with her at the workbench and teach her the names of the parts, the balance wheel, the anchor, the escape wheel, the escape, the spring, the pendulum. She would repeat them in a quiet, hoarse voice, over and over again, until the names became a part of her, just as the words of a prayer become a part of a priest. One day, Midori looked up from the mechanism and said she could see it. The clock on the wall. The third one from the left. The mantle clock with a chime. Its anchor was malfunctioning every other time. She wasn't seeing it with her eyes, with something else. Eli came over. He checked. The anchor was indeed misfiring. Every other beat. The axle was seizing up. Wear and tear. He looked at Midori. She was looking at him, without pride, without fear, with a question. Could she do it? Did she have the right? He nodded. He handed her the tweezers. She adjusted the pinion. In 3 movements, the mantle clock ran smoothly. Midori set down the tweezers. Her hands didn't tremble. Eli thought that in a few years she'd be better than him, that she had a different kind of eye, fresh, unclouded. She sees what he has learned to see. The difference between talent and mastery is that mastery can be passed on. Anselm came every evening. He brought bread, sometimes wine. He sat in the corner. He read a book. He was silent. His presence was like a foundation, invisible, yet without it, everything would crumble. One evening, when the workshop had emptied and only the 2 of them remained, Anselm spoke up about a woman, a parishioner, many years ago. She used to come to church every Sunday. with bruises, which she attributed to the stairs, to the door frame, her own clumsiness. Anselm knew. Everyone knew. Her husband drank. Her husband beat her. Anselm went to the priest. The priest said that the church doesn't interfere in family matters, that marriage is sacred, that one must pray. Anselm prayed. The woman died 3 months later. She fell down the stairs. Officially, Anselm stopped praying that day. A year later, he was excommunicated for saying in a sermon that a God who does not protect the weak is not worth praying to. Eli listened. Then he took out a watch without hands. He placed it on Anselm's wrist. He closed his eyes. He saw the former priest's watch. Large, powerful. The gears turned smoothly. The mainspring was well wound. Anselm had plenty left, a great deal, but in one place there was an old crack, overgrown, like a scar, a crack in the anchor. The anchor is will, a crack in his will, in the very place where Anselm had decided to remain silent, where he'd decided to go to the abbot instead of going to her husband, where he'd decided to pray instead of taking action. Eli couldn't undo it. It was too long ago, too deep, but he could point it out. He described to Anselm what he saw. He said the crack was old, that it had healed, that Anselm's will had held firm, that the anchor was working. It faltered sometimes, on those nights when Anselm couldn't sleep and thought about the woman with the bruises, but it worked. And he added one more thing, that he could see further into the mechanism, that a chain of events had branched off from that decision, that if Anselm had gone to the husband instead of the abbot, the husband would have killed him. Anselm, there, in that house, that evening, and the woman a week later, because the husband was one of those people whose clock runs precisely, whose spring never breaks, whose evil is built into the mechanism, not a malfunction, the design. Anselm couldn't save her, not with prayer, not with his fists, not at all. It wasn't a comfort, but it was a release from guilt. Anselm sat there, silent, for a long time. Then he stood up. He placed his hand on Elijah's shoulder, heavy, warm. He said one word, "My son." Without the priesthood, without the church, just one person to another. Sarah came every other day. She examined Theo Mirta, who was slowly recovering in the back room. She argued with Eli about the nature of his gift. She jotted down her observations in a thick notebook. She smoked her pipe by the door. Once, she stayed late. The workshop was empty. They sat at the workbench. Sarah was silent. Then she told him. Her sister, the younger one, Lena, 6 years old, a lung disease, 10 years ago. Sarah was a student, a sophomore in medical school. She knew enough to understand what was happening, too little to help. Lena was fading away for 3 weeks. Sarah sat by her side every day. She read her fairy tales, held her hand, counted her breaths, just as Eli had counted Holzer's breaths. 7 seconds, 9, 12. Lena died on Wednesday morning, in her sleep. Sarah became a doctor 4 years later, the only female surgeon at St. Maur. Every day she walked into the hospital and tried to do what she hadn't been able to do for Lena, to save someone, anyone. And every day someone died, no matter what. Eli couldn't turn back the clock on a death that had happened 10 years ago. He couldn't bring Lena back. He couldn't fix what had been broken long before he even knew the clock existed. But he could do something else. He pulled Holzer's old notes out of the workbench drawer. A thick notebook, tiny handwriting, prescriptions, formulas, treatment plans. Holzer was a watchmaker, but he understood medicine better than most doctors. He understood that the body is also a mechanism, that illness is a malfunction in a specific part, that some malfunctions can be predicted and prevented if you know where to look. The notebook contained methods, old ones, forgotten ones, based on the knowledge of the Watchmakers Guild, methods of diagnosis based on breathing patterns, on pulse rate at specific times of day, on the temperature of the palms, things that modern medicine has not yet discovered, or has already forgotten. Eli gave the notebook to Sarah. She read all night. She didn't leave. She sat at the workbench by candlelight and read. She turned the pages with the same care one uses when handling fragile objects. In the morning, she came to the workshop with red eyes. She said that if even a third of these methods worked, hundreds of children could be saved. Thousands. She said she would test them, every single method, one by one, scientifically, without magic, without miracles, only science, only her hands, her mind, and patience. Eli nodded. He thought Holzer would have approved. The old man didn't believe in miracles. He believed in craftsmanship, in his hands, in patience, in the silence between the ticks. He thought that perhaps this was the true salvation, not a rollback, not the magical ticking of God's clock, but a notebook of notes that one master left for another. Who would leave it for a third? And so on, until the disease that killed Lena becomes as distant and harmless as the plague. One evening, a woman in monastic garb knocked on the door. A dark cassock, a white collar, her hood thrown back, a young face, smooth, without a single wrinkle, but her eyes were old, ancient, like the eyes of the statues in the cathedral. Gloves on her hands, white, never once removed in public. She asked to have her rosary repaired, small, wooden, with a metal cross at the end. The cross was bent, barely noticeable, by half a degree. Most people wouldn't have noticed. She did. Eli took the rosary, straightened the cross. It took a second. Tweezers, light pressure, done. He handed it back. The woman took them, looked at them, ran her finger along the cross, nodded. She didn't leave. She stood there looking at Eli, at his graying temples, at his hands, at the workbench, at the 40 watches on the walls, as if she were recognizing something, as if she'd seen it before, a long time ago, a very long time ago. Eli looked at her. He concentrated. He saw the clock, and a chill ran down his spine. This woman's clock had stopped, completely. Not a single gear was turning. Not a single spring was wound. Not a single balance wheel was swinging. A dead mechanism. Absolutely dead, but not broken. Intact. Perfect. Just stopped. Like a watch that had been wound and stopped at the very same second, and left to stand still for 200 years. But the woman was breathing. She was speaking. She was standing before him, alive, with a stopped clock. Alive in defiance of everything Eli knew about life and death and the mechanisms in between. He asked her name. She answered, Sister Yvette. Her voice was steady, calm, like the ticking of a fine timepiece. He asked how old she was. She smiled. For the first time, her lips moved unnaturally, like a mechanism that hadn't been used in a long time. She said she didn't remember. She'd stopped counting long ago. Eli stood there and looked at her stopped clock, at her young face with ancient eyes, and he realized that standing before him was a mystery he couldn't solve. Goodbye, he said. He offered her some tea. She shook her head. She said she didn't drink, didn't eat, not for a long time, didn't need to. She said she'd come back tomorrow, if she could. Eli said the studio was open to everyone. Yvette nodded. She stepped out into the evening, silently, like a shadow, like someone who had forgotten how to take up space. Yvette came every evening. She sat in an armchair by the fireplace. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She just sat there. She watched the fire, the 40-hour clock on the wall, the people filling the workshop. Cora clattered with tools and cursed under her breath. Midori sat at the workbench, taking apart a pocket watch with the patience of a nun. Anselm read in the corner. Sarah stopped by after her shift at the hospital with red eyes and a cigarette in her mouth. Evelyn arrived a week after Yvette. She'd run away from her father's house the day before her wedding, quiet, gentle-looking, strong as steel on the inside. She learned to make coffee in 2 days. Within a week, she'd taken over the workshop's bookkeeping. She counted every coin. She drew up estimates. She spoke to suppliers in a voice that made them turn pale and lower their prices. Eli looked at her and thought that 20 years in the Duke's household had taught her things that no school could ever teach. She knew how to manage people, money, space. All her life, she'd been treated like a thing, an object, a dowry. No one had ever told her she was capable. Eli did, once, over dinner. He said that without her, the workshop would have gone bankrupt within a month. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away, but her shoulders straightened. And from that day on, she began to walk through the workshop, not as a guest, but as the mistress of the house. Yvette watched all of this, silently, with eyes in which something resembling warmth shone through. She spoke only with Anselm, about faith, about God, about why clocks tick if they're going to stop anyway. Anselm replied that they don't tick for the sake of the result. They tick because that's how they're made. You don't live to get somewhere. You live because you're alive. Yvette listened. She tilted her head. She thought. She said she didn't remember what it was like to tick. Anselm said that was normal, that he himself had forgotten many times, and each time he remembered anew. Eli studied Yvette's watch every time she came. The mechanism was perfect, flawless, better than anything he'd ever seen in his life, better than the god's watch in his pocket. Every detail was carved with a precision that went beyond human craftsmanship. Every gear sat on its axis without the slightest gap. Every spring was wound exactly as much as needed, but everything had stopped. 200 years without a single tick, like a perfect watch that had been forgotten to be wound. One night, Yvette stayed behind after everyone else had left. Midori was sleeping in the back room. Cora had gone upstairs. Anselm had gone to his room. Sarah had left for the hospital. Evelyn had fallen asleep over the ledgers, and Cora had carried her to bed. The workshop was quiet. The 40 clocks were ticking. The fire was dying down. The coals glowed orange. Yvette sat in an armchair. Eli sat at the workbench. Between them was a table with a cooled-down teapot and 2 cups. One was his. The second was set there out of habit, for the one who doesn't drink tea, doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, doesn't age. 200 years old. Yvette spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, like the ticking of a chronometer. She said she had been his first apprentice 1,000 years ago, when God was still a man, a watchmaker in another world, a friend of time. His name was Edwin. He was old, sick. His hands trembled, but his mind was clear. He understood what no one before him had understood, that death is a mechanism, that a mechanism has parts, that those parts can be seen, understood, repaired, or reassembled. He decided to build the Great Clock, a mechanism that would measure out death for everyone, fairly, precisely, so that children wouldn't die before the elderly, so that illness would come when the body was ready, not when fate took a whim, so that murderers wouldn't live longer than those they killed. This required a life, a whole one, more than one. Edwin was dying. He lacked time, not skill, not materials, time. Yvette was his assistant, his right-hand woman, his apprentice. She watched him work, at night, by candlelight, with trembling hands and a clear mind. She saw how he grew weaker every day, how the gears slipped from his fingers, how the tweezers trembled, how his eyes welled up with tears from the strain. She decided on her own. He didn't ask. She offered to give him her time, all of it, entirely, so he could finish the work. He refused, for a long time. 3 days, 3 nights. She stood her ground, because she remembered. Why all of this? For whom? She said a name, and fell silent. Her face went blank, like a clock face without hands. She said she'd forgotten, that 200 years ago she'd forgotten the name, that she only remembered there had been someone small, someone she loved, someone for whom she'd agreed to stop her clock forever. But the name was gone. Memory, too, is a mechanism, and without movement it rusts, it wears away, it crumbles, like an old engraving on a copper lid. Edwin finished his work. He became a god. The great clock began to tick. The world became more just. Children stopped dying before their time, almost. Yvette remained, without time, without death, without moving forward, frozen, not alive, not dead, in between. She said she hadn't come to Elijah for the rosary. She came because she heard a tick, across the entire continent, across mountains and rivers and forests. When he uttered the first name on the pier, the ratchet of released attention, she heard it. like a sleeper hears an alarm clock, through 200 years of silence, and she followed the sound. Like a watchmaker follows the ticking of a faulty mechanism. She said she wanted to understand one thing, whether it was worth giving the clock back, whether it was worth fixing the world, or whether the world was already broken forever, and there's nothing left to fix. Eli was silent, he thought, for a long time. The fire had almost gone out. The coals were smoldering. Shadows moved across the walls. The 40 clocks ticked. Then he asked if she remembered why she had agreed 1,000 years ago. Yvette shook her head. No, she doesn't remember. Just a shadow, just a feeling. Small hands, warm. Someone she was holding, long ago, in another life that had come to a standstill. Eli took out the clock without hands. He opened the lid. 2 gears were in place, the gear of memory and the second one he'd found in the monastery. He asked Yvette to give him her hand. She looked at him for a long time. Then she slowly slipped the glove off her right hand. Her hand was white, cold, like marble, like stone, like something that had ceased to be alive, but hadn't yet become dead. He touched her fingers. His fingers were warm. Hers were icy. And he entered her watch. He didn't just see it. He entered it, like entering a room, like entering a cathedral, a huge mechanism, dark, motionless, majestic, gears the size of mill wheels, springs as thick as ship's ropes, an anchor like a cathedral bell, a pendulum like a ship's mast, and silence, absolute, deafening, the silence of 2 centuries. Eli walked through the mechanism, tiny, like a mouse inside a grandfather clock. He looked at every detail. He searched. There had to be something that would tell her what she had forgotten. He walked for a long time, past the gears, past the springs, past the axles and levers, and he found it, on the tiniest gear, right at the center of the mechanism, where, for ordinary people, the ratchet of attention sits, an engraving, worn away by time, almost invisible, like an inscription on a 200-year-old gravestone. He took out a magnifying glass, that very one, the one he'd used 1,000 times at his workbench. He held it up to the engraving. He read it. 1 word, 5 letters, Emile. He stepped out of the mechanism. He opened his eyes. Yvette was sitting across from him, waiting, her face blank. Her eyes were ancient. He said the name aloud. Emile. Yvette shuddered, her whole body, like a clock that had been brought to life, like a mechanism into which the missing gear had been inserted. Her eyes flew open. Her mouth parted slightly. Her hands, which had lain motionless on her lap for 200 years, rose to her face, and she remembered. Emile, her brother, the youngest, the little one, 3 years old, curly hair, a laugh like a bell, an illness that came in the winter and didn't go away in the spring. He was fading away, like a candle, slowly, day by day, little by little, and there was nothing she could do, nothing. She held him in her arms and counted his breaths. 7 seconds, 9, 12. Edwin had promised. When the great clock began to tick, not a single child would die before their time. Not one, ever. She had given up her time for that promise, for Emile, for all the Emiles who would come after, and she had forgotten. 200 years had erased the name, but they hadn't erased the engraving on the tiniest gear at the center of her stopped mechanism, because some things are etched deeper than time can reach. Yvette smiled, a real smile. Her lips moved unnaturally, like a mechanism that had rusted and turned with effort, but the smile was real, the first in 200 years. She said she now knew the answer, what was worth it, what needed to be fixed, that the clock needed to be set right, that the promise still stood, that children shouldn't die before their time, that she hadn't given her time in vain. She stood up, slowly. She put on a glove, smoothed out her robe, looked at Eli, said she would leave, that she needed to see him. Edwina, God. the old clockmaker who became who he was because she had given him time, to tell him that she remembers, that Emile, that the promise, that the children. She stepped out into the night, silently, like a shadow. The door closed. Eli was left alone. The fire had gone out. The 40 clocks ticked in the darkness. He sat and listened to the silence between the ticks. He thought of Holzer, of the letter he'd found in the double bottom of the case a week ago. Old paper, yellowed, tiny handwriting, shaky, written by old hands. Holzer wrote that God's clock cannot be fully repaired, that one part will always be missing, the one the master takes so that the clock comes to life. He took his own, his guilt, his pain, his wife, whom he failed to save, but he couldn't put it back in because he was repairing it for himself, for the sake of his guilt, for the sake of his pain. A clock does not accept a part for itself, only for another. Holzer realized this too late, 30 years later, when his hair was already white and his hands were trembling. He wrote, "Boy, I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. You'll find your own part. Don't look for it. It will find you on its own, when you're ready." Eli thought about this for weeks. What it meant, which part he had to give up, what to lose. The answer didn't come from the manuscripts. It didn't come from his reflections. It didn't come from the clock without hands that he stared at every night. The answer came from life. In the morning, an ordinary morning, Cora stood next to him by the mirror. He was looking at his graying temples. She raised her hand, ran her fingers through the gray strands. She didn't say anything. She just touched him. Her fingers were warm, smelling of machine oil, with short nails, with calluses from wrenches. And he closed his eyes, and he thought that this was what made life worth living. This, warm fingers on his temple, the smell of oil, the ticking of the clock behind the wall. Anselm's voice saying the kettle had boiled. Evelyn's laughter, the tap of Midori's tweezers on the workbench, the scratch of Sarah's pen in her observation notebook. This, all of this, the life of an ordinary watchmaker in a workshop on the waterfront. And he realized that this was exactly what he was willing to give up. Not Cora, not love, not people. His ability, his gift, what makes him special. What sets him apart from every other watchmaker in this world. The ability to see other people's watches, to repair them, to wind them back, to save them, to name the malfunctions, to hear the tick of God's clock. He had to give this up so that the clock would keep running, so that the world would be mended, so that the promise made to Yvette 1,000 years ago would come true. Children shouldn't die before their time. There's a price to pay for this. And that price is himself, not his life, his gift. A month later, what was bound to happen, happened. Eli knew it would happen. He could feel it. The way you feel when a spring is wound to its limit and ready to make its final turn. There was a knock at the workshop door in the middle of the night. Quiet, polite, like the knock of an old acquaintance who doesn't want to wake the neighbors. Everyone was asleep. Cora upstairs, Midori in the back room. Eli, alone in the workshop, by the light of a single candle. He opened the door. Standing on the threshold was an old man in a worn frock coat, gray-haired, stooped, short, hands in his pockets. His face was wrinkled and weary. His eyes were like Yvette's, ancient. But unlike Yvette's, there was movement in them, weary, slow, but movement. The eyes of a man who had worked for 1,000 years without a break and had forgotten what rest was. But he hadn't forgotten why he worked. He asked if he could come in a quiet voice, polite, the voice of a craftsman, not a god. Eli stepped back. The old man entered. He looked around. He looked at the 40 clocks on the walls. He listened. He tilted his head. He listened closely to each one by one, like a watchmaker who enters someone else's workshop and, out of respect, listens to the work of others before speaking of his own. He nodded. He said that Holzer had set them up well, that each one had its own voice, its own rhythm, that a master who tunes 40 clocks so that none interferes with another knows what he's doing. Eli put the kettle on. He took out 2 cups. He poured tea, one for himself, the other for for the old man. They sat at the workbench and drank tea, in silence. The old man warmed his hands against the cup. His fingers were thin, long, the fingers of a master. A minute later, Eli noticed a callus on the index finger of the old man's right hand, small, hard, right where a watchmaker holds a screwdriver. 1,000 years. The callus hadn't worn away in 1,000 years, because he never stopped working. The old man finished his tea, set down the cup, spoke up, said that Yvette had found him, told him about the workshop, about Eli, about the name on the gear, about Emil. He said he hadn't come to take it away, not to demand it. He'd come to ask, because a clock cannot be taken away. It can only be given away, voluntarily, just as Yvette gave away her time, just as Holzer gave away his guilt, just as every master gives away something of his own. He showed Eli what was happening in a world without the great clock. Not with words, he simply touched his hand. And Eli saw it, the world, vast, ticking in disarray, millions of clocks, billions, without order, without justice, children dying of diseases that could be cured, old people living in pain because death has forgotten them, murderers walking the earth for decades, mothers losing their children just 3 steps away because a seagull cried out at the wrong moment. Chaos, pain, randomness instead of order. Eli withdrew his hand. He was breathing heavily. His eyes were wet. For the first time in 12 years, ever since he'd walked into the workshop as a 7-year-old boy and learned not to cry, the old man waited. He didn't rush him. Eli took the watch out of his pocket. He set it on the workbench. He opened the case back. 2 gears, and he saw. All 7 compartments were filled. The gears were in place, dark, warm, alive. 7 out of 7. He hadn't noticed when the rest had appeared, the gear of justice. Maybe when he turned Drake down, when he said, "You can't undo what isn't broken," that justice isn't what a person wants, but what actually is. The gear of compassion. Maybe when he lay on the dirty basement floor for 4 hours, repairing Theo Mirta. Piece by piece, crack by crack, no charge, no payment, just his hands. The gear of acceptance. Maybe when he told the woman that her father was dying his own death, that it wasn't a mistake, that it was his time, and he accepted her spitting at his feet as part of his job. The gear of forgiveness. Maybe when he showed Anselm his watch and freed him from guilt, or when he didn't turn Kyle in but didn't condemn him either. He just walked away. The gear of letting go. Maybe when he gave Sarah Holzer's notebook, he let go of the notes in the Holzer's notes. He gave them to a stranger, because that's the right thing to do, because knowledge shouldn't lie in a drawer. It was earned, not by force, not by searching, by living. Every cup of tea set out for the dead master, every bowl of soup eaten with Cora, every evening with Midori at the workbench, every night when Anselm read a book in the corner, all of these were cogs. One last thing remained, the cog of sacrifice. Holzer's letter, the part the master takes from himself so that the clock comes to life. Eli looked at the old man, at God, at Edwin, who 1,000 years ago had been an ordinary watchmaker with trembling hands and a callus on his finger. He asked what he had to give up. The old man shook his head, slowly, like a pendulum. He said he didn't know, that 1,000 years ago he had given up his life. He had become a god. He had ceased to be human. He had ceased to be a master. He had ceased to repair ordinary clocks for ordinary people. That was his part, his price. Eli would have his own. Eli closed his eyes. He thought of Cora, of her fingers on his temple, of how she smelled of oil and salt, of how the workshop would be empty without her. He thought of Midori, of her quiet voice repeating the names of the parts, of her hands, which in a few years would be better than his own. He thought of Anselm, of his heavy hand on his shoulder, of the words he had spoken, "My son." He thought of Sarah, of her red eyes peering over Holzer's notebook, of the 1,000 children she would save. He thought of Evelyn, of her straight shoulders, of her voice that made suppliers turn pale, about how, for the first time in her life, she feels needed. He thought about all of this, and he understood. He is giving up his ability, the gift of seeing other people's watches, the gift of repairing them, the gift of winding them back, the gift of speaking their names. Everything that makes him the Watchmaker of death, everything for which the three factions had been hunting him, everything that had cost him gray temples and a face that looked 40 at 20. He's giving it all away, and he remains an ordinary craftsman, with ordinary hands, with ordinary eyes, with an ordinary life, in an ordinary workshop. He thought that Holzer wanted exactly that, not a hero, not a god, a master who repairs ordinary watches for ordinary people, who asks for a name, who finds out what a person likes for breakfast, who touches a shoulder before letting them go, who remembers. He opened his eyes, looked at the watch, at the 7 cogs. He said, "The cog of sacrifice." The master gives his gift so that the clock may keep time for everyone. His voice didn't tremble. His hands didn't tremble. The clock ticked, loudly, clearly, like a bell. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 ticks, one for each cog, and they began, smoothly, calmly, steadily, like a clock that had been running for 1,000 years, and stopped, and started again. The old man held out his hand. Eli placed the watch in his palm. The old man's fingers closed around it, gently, as if around a living being. He put the watch in his frock coat pocket. He looked at Eli, for a long time, with something in his eyes that was more than gratitude. That resembled the respect one master has for another. He nodded. He stood up. He walked to the door. He opened it. He turned around on the threshold. He said one thing. He said that Midori would grow up, that the gift does not leave the world. It is passed on, just as a craft is passed from master to apprentice. That Eli had done what mattered most. He hadn't repaired the watch. He had taught his apprentice. He stepped out into the alley. His footsteps faded. The door remained open. The night air, salt, the sea, the distant horn of a steamship. Eli closed the door. He sat down at the workbench. The tea in his cup had grown cold. He tried to catch a glimpse of the watch, his own. In the mirror above the sink, nothing. Just an ordinary reflection. Graying temples, a gaunt face, dark circles under his eyes, wrinkles around his mouth that hadn't been there a year ago. He's 20 years old, but in the mirror is a man who looks 40, maybe older. He smiled, a crooked smile, a tired smile. But he smiled, because in the mirror was an ordinary craftsman, not the watchmaker of death, not a thief who happened to become a hero, not a link in a chain, an ordinary craftsman, with a callus on the index finger of his right hand, just like God's. A crash came from the workshop. It was Cora's voice. She'd woken up. She came downstairs. She saw him sitting alone by candlelight. She was yelling that Anselm had spilled tea on the blueprints again, that this clumsy oaf couldn't put a single piece of paper down without ruining it. Anselm stood in the doorway with a guilty look on his face and a wet towel in his hand. Evelyn peeked out from behind his shoulder. She laughed, quietly, ringing, like a bell. Sarah was knocking on the door, early, too early for a visit. They'd brought in an injured man, a dock worker. He'd fallen from the winch. They needed hands. They needed help. Midori's voice from the back room. Quiet, hoarse. She was already lighting the burner. Not because she'd been asked to, because she'd heard the knock on the door, because she knew that light and warmth and hot water would be needed now, because she was learning to be a master. Eli stood up. He took the apron off the wall, an old one, leather, Holzer style, stained with oil and wax and thousands of repaired watches. He put it on, tied it at the back. He rolled up his shirt sleeves to his elbows. His hands, ordinary, without a gift, without a glow, without the ability to see the invisible, but with calluses, with 12 years of memory, with thousands of repaired mechanisms in every finger, the hands of a master. He looked at the Holzer clock on the mantelpiece, a mantel clock, an old one, with a lunar calendar that Cora had repaired. It ticked, steadily, precisely, alive, like the heart of the workshop. He walked over, he listened. He placed his palm on the case, warm, wooden, with fine scratches from 40 years of life. Inside, the mechanism ticked, assembled by the hands of a man who had stolen a clock from God, failed to save his wife, and had been in hiding for 40 years, yet was still the finest craftsman Eli had ever known. He withdrew his hand, turned around, stepped out of the workshop into the hallway, toward the people, toward the clamor and voices and laughter and clatter, toward Cora, who was swearing, Anselm, who was smiling guiltily, Evelyn, who was laughing, Sarah, who was waiting with the wounded man, Midori, who was lighting the burner, toward life, ordinary life, noisy, warm, smelling of oil and tea and the sea breeze coming through the open window. Satmore, spring. The Verne and Holzer workshop is taking orders.